Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me this Sunday. I'm really excited to be with you today to talk to you about human evolution through the cosmos. So, I'm going to say hello to everybody on Rumble who is watching me today. I'm really glad to be streaming there as well as YouTube. So this is actually a dual stream, and you can actually subscribe to me on Rumble as well as YouTube. We're really not sure how things are going to go in regards to just freedom of speech and censorship and all of that. So I highly recommend that you go over to Rumble as well and sign up, because if anything does happen to this account, I will be streaming there or, wherever. So this lecture does include a PDF or a little lecture brief, and you'll be able to find that in the description, or you'll find Wolf putting that in the chat for you. It's not a huge lecture brief today like we had last time. It's just a little small one. And the lecture is probably going to go for, I think, like maybe around an hour and a half or 2 hours. And then after that, I'm going to dive into your questions. So the end of this lecture will be your time to ask any questions that you have about the material that I'm covering. Also, when it does come to the Q&A, just to be really clear, just please ask questions in regards to what I've covered, just for the replay. And that's it. So today, we are going to be looking at the path or the journey of the soul through the solar system. And this is a really important conversation today, because I think that we have sort of this strange idea of our soul and what happens after we die. And we often just say, oh, we're going to the other side. When we pass over, we're going to the other side. And there's sort of little, we almost project what we want it to be. We kind of project our idea of what the other side is based on our life here. And that's not really the case. When we pass over, or even when we go into a meditative state, anytime we enter that spiritual realm or re-enter that spiritual realm, we're actually entering a very definite structure. We're actually entering a system of planes or a system of planetary spheres. And it's actually really organized. There are mysteries about it, and there's definitely things that are mysterious about it, but it's absolutely a structure. So it's really important that we understand this, because our solar system is really like, it's kind of like a big school that takes a very long time to complete. But that's really what our solar system is like. And so when we understand, what a planetary sphere is and what density it occupies, what density it holds, we start to really begin to understand what the cosmos are, and in turn, who we are and what we are. That's when we really start to get it. Okay, so today we're going to be exploring the pattern of evolution through birth and death and reincarnation, and how this pattern is really embodied in the structure of the cosmos. We're gonna look at how the planetary spheres also hold the structures of the cosmos together. And we're going to explore the evolution of the human soul within the solar system through something that's called the life wave. So what is the life wave? And then also the rope of consciousness. Lastly, and this is where things get very interesting and very relevant to today, we're going to talk about what happens when life, or when we as human beings can take a divergent path, a divergent evolutionary path, or essentially leave the life wave or leave the rope of consciousness. Okay. So the kind of questions we are going to touch on today is, when we die, what happens, or where do we go? Roughly, we're going to touch kind of roughly on that. Also, how does the human soul move through the solar system, and how does the solar system and the spheres within the solar system, how does it relate to our spiritual life, our psychic development, and just how does our soul move through them and relate to them specifically. And really exploring, is there a specific path of cosmic initiation for the soul? So if we take things like the idea of being initiated into, say, a mystery school or into a spiritual discipline, can that graded initiation process be divided into planetary spheres, or can the planetary spheres sort of hold together the grades of initiation or combine to create certain grades of initiation? This is kind of a bit of an advanced topic, but we're really beginning to, when we start thinking like this and exploring this, we begin to genuinely be functioning within our cosmic consciousness. To be within your cosmic consciousness is to think as the spheres, to think as these higher bodies, and to know how they work within you. And so we're also going to answer the question, what is a life wave? What is the rope of consciousness? And divergency, and what happens when a human being mutilates or degrades their consciousness, as I mentioned. And we're also going to get in some very interesting work from Rudolf Steiner about beings that are held back. And what does it mean to be held back in your evolutionary cycle? And how does that interact with the rest of life? What is that process like? We're going to examine all of that today. So the foundation of all of this, what we really have to understand is that we are multidimensional. Human beings are multidimensional. So what does that mean? That means that as a human being, we actually exist on different planes of consciousness simultaneously. So even though I'm sitting here with a physical body in the physical world talking to you, I am also existing in higher worlds simultaneously. The etheric realm, the astral realm, the higher planes of imagination. And there's many different words for these planes as well. So while we are here in 3D, we are also radiating and echoing in other planes. That's incredible, but that's what we are. And all of these higher aspects of ourselves are feeding into and pinging with where we are here in the material plane, and our mind is sort of holding all of this together. But we are fundamentally multidimensional beings. And you can see in your little booklet, you'll see that there is a very little simplistic drawing of basically the energetic bodies. Very simple. But you can see that we have an etheric body and an astral body, and all of these bodies, and they actually correspond to actual gradations or actual planes in the cosmos. So we are basically a complete embodiment of the cosmos. We can look at it as the embodiment of all of the spheres, or we can look at it as actually being broken up into gradients of higher matter. So these different bodies, our physical body, our etheric body, mental, emotional, spiritual, or astral, these are all different parts of our consciousness. These are what makes us multidimensional. So we can also look at this as though we are alive in the cosmos already. There's an aspect of you that is associated with Venus. There's an aspect of you that is associated with Mars, with the sun. So when we look out into the sky as well, we are looking out at ourselves. And when we interact with the cosmos and the world around us, we are really interacting with a higher version of ourself and communicating with those aspects in direct ratio to how developed we are. So it's kind of like we live in one big mirror, because our inner world is an exact mirror of the outer world. And that's what makes the solar system a very interesting school to be in. Okay, so if we're multidimensional, how do we experience these different planes? Like if you're just here in your physical body, using your mind, how do we experience different planes of existence? How do we experience the different planetary spheres? Well, we're constantly referencing them all the time. There isn't a time where you're not receiving psychic information. We tend to kind of shut down at times and say, I'm overloaded and I'm going to shut down my consciousness and only receive a very like small spectrum of energy. But we're always receiving this information from higher planes all the time. We depend on it. And actually, that is the real root of astrology, is to understand how we are receiving energy from higher worlds. Because the energy of higher worlds is directly pushed through the planetary spheres to us. So part of the higher planes is radiated to us through the planetary spheres. And that's why astrology was such a huge is a huge vehicle of personal discovery. Okay. And the planetary spheres embody larger cosmic themes and eras. Now, this lecture series, which is called Star Wisdom, is actually an extension of my Isis Rising series. I had to kind of change its name because I guess YouTube didn't like the word Isis in there, but we've covered these topics in Isis Rising. And so this is a little extension of that material. And in that material, we discussed that the planetary spheres, they are embodying larger cosmic themes or larger themes within humanity. And they're also embodying certain eras of time for humanity. They're also embodying certain eras of time, humanity's past or humanity's future. They are embodying that, and we are relating to them. So this is part of how our consciousness works. Okay, so spheres are kind of like, the planetary spheres are kind of like these massive timekeepers or wisdom keepers. We look at them and we think, oh, there's Saturn. Oh, there's the moon, or oh, there's Mars. This is just a physical sphere. No, that is the physical representation of something much, much, much greater. We have a spiritual relationship with these bodies, and these bodies have their own different sort of evolutionary cycles as well that can overlap with our own. Okay. So another way that we experience higher planes and the planetary spheres is over very long periods of time. So one of the ways that we experience the planetary spheres very directly is that we will have periods of our time where we kind of incarnate into them, just like we incarnate into Earth. And they represent specific initiation points of humanity in the school of the solar system. In Edgar Cayce's work, he calls these planetary sojourns. And in theosophy and anthroposophy, we can see them expressed in planetary chains. You'll also see that in your book on page 7 and 8. You're going to see the esoteric spiritual expression of our solar system, of the planetary spheres. So we experience them also by literally incarnating into them, just as we would Earth. And every sphere has a different type of life or kind of life, or it builds on the next, and it sort of evolves us in a different way. All right. So you could also say that we incarnate on different spheres as the solar system evolves, and that every planetary sphere is like a schoolhouse, a different schoolhouse that evolves humanity in a specific way. And we move through all the planes of creation organically through the life impulse, which is driven by the Christ impulse. So I'm going to say that again. We've been talking about how we are intimately connected with the planetary spheres. Even though we're physical right now, we are connecting with them all the time. They're projecting certain truths onto us. When we pass or when we do psychic work, we may actually visit these spheres. We have different lives within these spheres, different aspects of ourselves associated with them. But what is the force? What is the force that sort of pushes us through the school of the solar system? So what pushes us, what drives us through this planetary development? You know, if we look back, we had old moon. Before Earth, we had something that's called the old moon. And then we had the sun phase. And then we had the Saturn phase. This is in your book on page 8. So what drives us through all of these different phases? It's something called the life wave. And the life wave is this, it's like this stream of energy that we attach to it, that we ride in on. It's created by our consciousness, but it is really, you could really see it as like solar consciousness, or you could see it as Christ consciousness. And we sort of attach to it in a way, and we are driven through this planetary school based on our relationship to it. And it's sort of this driving force that we spiral around and that we incarnate into, that pushes us through our school of the solar system. So that's called the life wave. And it's a life wave because once the life wave hits a planet, it will come to life, and it will go through various phases of existence, just like a classroom. And the human being will evolve. And then that life wave will leave a certain planet and go into another planet. And then we'll go through those phases of existence, just like a schoolhouse. And so we follow the life wave through the entire expression of the solar system, from the beginning to the end. And we can see that as the Christ impulse as well. That's what creates the life wave. And that's what keeps us in the life wave. That's what keeps us evolving, okay? So going a little bit deeper into this life wave, because we have to understand that when we begin incarnating in the solar system, it's not random. It's not like you can kind of leave whenever you feel like it, or start wherever you want. You go through the entire system, as we'll get into a little bit later. So as a human soul, we experience the life wave as reincarnation. So when we're talking about how the individual would experience the life wave, we experience that as reincarnation. And you can see every life that we have is sort of a different pearl on a string of pearls in our life wave. And we're kind of going into the collective life wave as well. So we're moving with time, we're evolving, okay? And so life after life, we flow with the cosmos, we flow with this life wave together. We see it as the evolution of our soul over time. We would see it as being the mechanism of evolution for our soul. And if we were to follow each incarnation, we would see it as one continuum or one wave or stream. All right. And so, of course, you know that we take lives on Earth and then also other spheres in the solar system as different kind of classrooms, if you will. And another way to look at sort of how our life wave moves through the solar system is that as the life wave moves through different planetary spheres, the planetary spheres have different densities. And so the planetary spheres also create sort of a gradation in density as well. And that is part of the mechanism, that switching, the falling out of matter, rising, the falling into matter, and that rising out of matter is really key for us to transmute things and to learn. Okay, so yeah. So we can also train ourselves. We don't have to wait until we, pass away and reincarnate to kind of burst into the cosmos and start interacting with higher planes and different spheres of life. we can actually train ourselves to develop through psychic development. And all psychic development really is just creating a greater permeability so that we can detach a little bit from the material planes and start to connect and read the energies of higher planes, of higher streams of energy. That's all that really is. We can, we don't have to wait until we die and to connect with that realm. All right. So in conclusion, we are multidimensional beings with aspects of our consciousness connecting with different planes and existing within different planetary spheres. See, we've always kind of known that we connected with different planes. That's very clear. What isn't always known, or what's forgotten in most New Age teachings, is that the planetary spheres help hold the planes together or mark certain planes, and that the planetary spheres are actually associated with different grades within the solar system. We naturally interact with higher planes subconsciously, and when we go through the death process, we also interact with them. However, we can train ourselves to experience energies from higher worlds through psychic development. The higher planes are held together by the planetary spheres, and each planetary sphere represents a different stage of both human and planetary development. We got that. So we cannot really examine our consciousness without seeing it as multidimensional. We can't really look at ourselves as human beings unless we know that we are truly reaching into other planes all the time. And we also have to understand that we are interconnected with the planetary spheres in very particular ways. Okay, now that we've got that foundation, there's a couple rules that exist when you begin to incarnate into this planetary system, or when you enter the life wave, especially the three-dimensional, especially once we reach the three-dimensional or this more dense expression of the life wave. So rule number 1, you must complete your evolution. Once you enter an incarnation cycle in a planetary system, in order to leave it, you must graduate out of it. You have to move through all of the phases of that system. So you have to move through all of the phases within the solar system in which you incarnate into. So we incarnate through basically what you would call a star. That star sort of, in a way, transforms into various different planetary bodies. And then we must move through this school of planetary bodies, because that's what it really is to us. It's this experience we have to go through. And then we basically come back out of it. So sometimes there's a very chaotic cosmology that happens within the New Age, which is basically like there's no rules. Nothing matters. You just kind of bloop, pop out into the ether, and you can just create whatever you want and do whatever you want. And there's this sort of Luciferian edge that denies all structure. And that is not the case. We incarnate in through a specific star. That star creates different bodies of experience that we have to understand and go through, and then we graduate out of it in a higher form. And as you can see on page 8, there's a little illustration of that. You can see that with the, you can see that it's sort of like a V, where when we incarnate into a solar system, we really begin very light as spiritual matter. And then we become denser and denser and denser until sort of all of the issues that we've accumulated in our life solidify. And then we move back up, lightening, kind of paralleling our fall. So our rise is a parallel process in steps as our fall. And so that's really what we're going through. We go through it like this, through that life wave. And we start at a very, very vast, very spiritual, almost like kind of a gas. And then we go deeper and deeper and deeper into matter, consolidating more and more and more. And then where you are in our development in the diagram 2, the first diagram on the 8th page, we are in the most physical sphere at this time. So we are at the most dense period, and we are beginning our rise out of it. And that's why this period is so hard, but that's also why it's so important. And all of these globes that you're seeing evolve us in a particular way. We get some kind of perspective from it. We get some kind of gift. Our body, our physical form is shifted in some way. You know, if we look at diagram 2 on page 8, again, the top diagram, and you can see that we're actually on the 1, 2, 3, 4th chain on the 4th globe. That's where Earth is. And it's right at that point, we actually got the energy of mind. And so right where we are at that lowest point of matter, what we gained during that sphere was actually mind, or manas. Before that, we didn't actually have the ability to think independently or to separate ourselves from God's mind. We sort of all moved together in this more intuitive way of life. And so when we came into deeper and deeper physicality around the time of the Atlantean epoch, things changed, and we actually got our mind, and we were able to think independently, and we were able to make calculations and look at something and figure it out. We had that separation, and that's why often that period is called the fall, is because we actually gained this other faculty that we didn't have in previous globes. So every single globe that we move through, we gain something. We gain a faculty, and we evolve as a being. And every single globe there depends on the other one. And that's why it's really a school system, is because you kind of want to move through all the globes, and you want to gain all of your gifts and all of your awareness. And all of your gifts and awareness, everything that you gain as you move through, are a direct reflection of God. They're a direct reflection of the cosmos. So you just basically become an embodiment of the cosmos, or an embodiment in many ways of the sun. It's actually pretty deep stuff, how we evolve to be a direct, how we evolve in our, we call our human body a temple, because the more physical we become, the deeper in matter we become, the more potential we have to actually materialize extremely high cosmic energies and actually bring them into matter. And then to ascend out of that is the highest initiation. It is the greatest initiation. So that's why we're here, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. So rule number 1, you must complete your evolution, though. So once you enter, you have to go through all of those chains of evolution, because you could also look at it as though all of those chains of evolution are kind of like one greater life. And if you look at the ancient Tibetan and ancient Indian teachings on this, they actually call it, the cosmic day or the cosmic night. They'll call the breaks in between the incarnations of spheres the cosmic nights, and they'll call times of life the cosmic day, because there's an element to this where we can also look at all of these different globes and all these different densities as one great life of our soul. And we can't really abandon it. We have to go through the whole thing. We have to come full circle. So you have to complete the evolution within your solar system. And it takes many, many, many incarnations to evolve. If we are on Earth now, where we are in this intense state of matter, we have actually been evolving for quite some time. We've been going through densities for a while. Another really important aspect of this rule that we have to complete the solar system that we enter is that our soul is really bonded with the Earth. So I'm using the Earth because the life wave is in the Earth and we are part of the life wave, and that's the context that we have. But our soul is an expression of the Earth, and the Earth is an expression of us. And so we actually contain this sacred bond and this sacred union with the planet Earth. And you could say that, we're kind of the Earth's keepers, and that part of our evolution is actually to understand how to care for the Earth, to see the Earth as an extension of ourself. And so the Earth and our human consciousness sort of makes an envelope of a very specific perspective. It makes a very specific envelope of, I guess you could say, perception. And we incarnate into that very specific perception within the Earth. And while we're incarnated on the Earth, we view it through that specific lens. And so when you're incarnated on the Earth, everything that you look out into the cosmos is going to be in regards to being on Earth. This is the form, this is the journey we are on. And so we're always going to be referencing it through that Earth perspective, if you will. We're not going to be on Earth and think that we're going to look out into the world as though we are a Saturn being. We're not going to be on Earth and then look out into the world and think that we are a Mars being or a type of humanity that's on Mars. Every single sphere that we encounter, that we connect in with, we will learn about based on the fact that we are on Earth. And we will learn about other worlds and other spheres based on the archetypal consciousness of the Earth that we have and that we incarnate into. Okay. Okay, this is also very important. We have the free will to go against our path. So, the rule that we're speaking about now is that we have to complete if we want to evolve. But we do have the free will to go against our path. We can go against the life wave. We can go against our inner voice, our inner Christ consciousness. We can choose, especially with with whatever free will we have, we can choose to go against it. But that means that you abandon your evolutionary path in the cosmos. If you go against natural order and cosmic laws, your soul essence will begin to fragment because it will become imbalanced and it will begin to sort of chip apart over time because you're going against the grain. And the energy that you're using to evolve in the life wave, evolve through your life path, you're using that to fight against your true purpose, against natural law, against your inner Christ. And so that power then begins to turn inward and it begins to fragment your consciousness. It begins to fragment your energy bodies. And this is what's meant in psychology and spirituality as fragmentation. They say, oh, you have to bring back all of these soul fragments. So if we go against our purpose, if we go against that inner voice, and our inner voice, and this is very important to know, your Christ consciousness within you Your inner voice is directly in sync with natural law. When you follow that voice, when you follow your heart, when you follow your intuition, that's going to work with natural law to lead you on the highest path of your evolutionary chain, of your life wave. When we abandon that, that force that is supposed to be evolving us will begin to fragment us. And so fragmentation is a very real thing. And that's something that we do want to avoid. But like I mentioned, around the time of Lemuria, Atlantis, we gained that individuality. We gained that independence. We gained mind. And with that mind, we have the ability to think of ourselves as gods rather than align with gods. And so that's part of our evolutionary challenge, is to not use our minds to go against our own evolutionary cycle, to go against our own soul, our own path, but to use it to understand natural law, to understand our soul, to understand higher worlds. So there's a level of humbleness we have to get through this. Okay? So if we move against our soul's path, if we deny cosmic law, that fragmentation can lead to us degrading to a point that we can no longer incarnate in the life wave. And we will go back to the beginning of planetary evolution. So I'm going to read that one more time. If we move against our soul's path, against our inner Christ consciousness, against our intuition, if we deny cosmic law, we think we're above it, we will eventually degrade to the point we can no longer incarnate into the life wave. And we will go back to the beginning of planetary evolution. It's just like failing a class in school. You have to go back and do it again. Okay? And as I mentioned before, just so it's really clear, the Christ stream, what we would call Christ consciousness, is the pure core of life that we reckon ourselves against. And we connect with it to remain whole. We connect with it to remain in our life wave, to remain in our incarnational pattern and not get outside of it. So we basically need to connect with our inner Christ to evolve. That is the path of evolution. We have to have that as the catalyst within us that evolves us. That keeps us evolving with the cosmos. That keeps us so we're not fragmenting. And you could say that Antichrist forces or Antichrist consciousness are the consciousnesses of fragmentation or of destruction or of death. You could look at it that way as well. So there is this gray area as we're taking our lives, as we're incarnating, where we can sort of get off our path a little bit. We can fall into fear and trauma and darkness. And we can try to, play God and go against nature. And when we do this, we sort of risk going into this gray area where we can become trapped, or you could look at it as sort of aspects of our being can sort of become trapped in what are called the lower worlds. And this would be typically called purgatory or hell, or in anthroposophy, this is very similar to the eighth sphere. But we have to understand that there are these aspects of ourselves that we can kind of leave behind, we can fragment in our evolutionary path. And these can be in sort of this gray area. And then we have a certain period of time where we can work with it and we can call them back and we can come full circle, and they can be reabsorbed and we can grow. But we can also continuously deny them and fragment even more and more and more and more until it's very difficult to actually take a form. It's actually very difficult to reincarnate. And we're going to talk about that at the end of this lecture. That's the last portion of that. Okay, so that was rule number 1. You must complete your evolution. Okay, there's no shortcuts. You don't get to just check out. You know, we have to complete the entire life wave through the entire solar system on the incarnating spheres. Got to do that. Okay. Okay, rule number 2. This is the second rule. To evolve, we also must align with the evolutionary impulse of the cosmos. So beyond the cosmos, beyond the Christ impulse being something that we align with in order to grow and to evolve, we also have to align with certain natural laws and a certain sort of these. The best examples that I like to use are expansion waves and contraction waves, and certain structures of the cosmos that sort of almost create polarity and duality. And we have to align with these forces and use them to grow. So one good way to look at that is we have to, we kind of come in here with our free will, and we subject ourselves to universal law, to cosmic law. We subject ourselves to expansion waves from the cosmos and contraction waves. And these can really mess us up, especially when we're all the way down in the 3D material world. The polarity feels so intense because, again, if you look at the diagram on page 8, diagram 2 at the top, you know, look how many globes that we've gone through to get through where we are now. And by the way, these diagrams are actually from Theosophy, as I've mentioned in other lectures. So look at how many we've gone through. Look at how many times we've split and come back together in various different ways. So you also call the expansion and contraction waves that shape us. We can also call them the great inhale and the great exhale. And it translates to periods of rise, periods of fall, an increasing in density, a decreasing in density. And so there is this natural undulation of the cosmos that we subject ourselves through that nobody can avoid. Nobody gets to not experience it. We all experience it. We also experience the same cosmic rays that will also create our environment. So we will be subject to not only expansion periods and contraction periods, dark ages, light ages, periods of falling in density, periods of rising in density. We will also make it a little bit more complicated, and we will experience different rays of consciousness at different intensities at different times. And we all experience that. So we're all incarnating into the same pressures. There's a shared pressure that we all choose to subject ourselves to. And this is outside of our individual karma, our individual personalities, and whatever pressures we've personally taken on as an individual. So, for example, we're going through this huge purging time in society, the very kind of cleansing time in society. But we're all being subjected to the same energies. And if we look at it, we can see, yes, we're all experiencing the same forces, but not everybody is dealing with it in the same way. And this is how you can tell the different levels of consciousness that are moving through this school of the solar system. Because again, and another interesting thing is that we can all be here on one planet, but we're not all at the same level of graduation. We're not at the same level of initiation in this solar system. So it's a very interesting experience. So rule number 2 is there are specific shared parameters of life and creation, and nobody is beyond them. So we're all subject to them. All right. Rule number 3, the third and the last rule that we're going to talk about today, is sort of more of a phenomenon. And this phenomenon is going to be important to understand in future lectures, okay? So rule number 3 is something called the rope of consciousness. And this rule, or this rope, is sort of made by the first 2 rules. So rule number 1, which is that when we enter a solar system for incarnation, we must complete it. And rule number 2, which is that we all experience the same cosmic laws and pressures. So these 2 rules create a rope of consciousness, a sort of band of consciousness. And just in case nobody knows what a rope looks like, I've included one on pages 9. So the first 2 rules create this compression of consciousness. And this is especially obvious when you reach the material plane or the 3D plane. So rule number 1, which is that you must complete your evolution, that creates a certain pressure, that creates a certain band. Esoterically, that creates a certain band of sort of, you can't escape this process. It creates a parameter or membrane. And then rule number 2, which is to evolve, we must align with all of the universal laws. That creates an even more compressed and sort of kind of like a band or like a rope. And why it's called the rope is that every individual's consciousness is coming into that band upon incarnation. That's part of the life wave, right? They're coming into this life wave, which could also be called this rope of consciousness. And they're weaving themselves in it. And we're all kind of in that rope of consciousness together. So every individual is like a little strand within the rope of consciousness. And the rope of consciousness is sort of doing this. It's got different pressures, but we're all kind of in this phase together. And you could also look at it as like a planetary consciousness, but we're all in this together. Okay. All right, so we're all moving together, and we're all moving through like we're basically, we're all moving through like we're in this sort of life wave string, kind of all entwined together, if you will. And this life wave or rope of consciousness begins in the higher realms. Well, it'll begin there, and in one constant, it will move. It will begin in the higher planes and then move downwards until it reaches the material plane and then rises up. And that's why it's a rope, and that's why we're sort of all tied together, is because it's a continuum, and it's not broken. It's one chain or one rope. Okay, and there's a little, you could also visualize it as a planetary chain as well, which is underneath the chain I like to use is the chain from anthroposophy. And that is on page 8 of the second picture. That is a good example of very large scale life wave or rope of consciousness. There we go. All right. And before we conclude this section and move on to the last one, the purpose to all human consciousness is to fully experience itself and God in kind of a systematic and precise way. So that is the goal, and that's why there are these structures and these laws, so that we can actually experience God, so we can experience ourselves. Okay. So there are specific laws to human evolution and to the evolution of our soul. Number one, when we enter a solar system for incarnation, we must complete it to evolve. A solar system is a specific school that we must graduate out of or complete. The life wave leads us through various expressions of our solar system, which initiate and shape our soul in specific ways. All human consciousness within a planetary sphere forms a rope of consciousness. So the rope of consciousness can also be seen as an exact phase of humanity that's bound by very specific laws, if you will. And why I'm saying laws is that if you move up in density or down in density, the laws change slightly, if you will. And when the laws change, when you go through a change in density, there's usually an initiation period. So if you go down in density or up in density, there has to be some kind of transformation that occurs. We usually call that like an end time. And then that will begin a different rope of consciousness. And all of these exist within one large life wave. But consciousness does shift depending on the density. And there are specific junction points within human evolution where consciousness does change. It becomes denser or lighter, but you sort of have to earn the ability to shift you have to learn the ability to shift in the cosmos. Does this make sense? Let me know if there's any questions around this. All human consciousness within a planetary sphere forms the rope of consciousness, which is the evolving collective consciousness of all beings within the sphere, within that certain density, within that certain plane. All beings are subject to the same laws or cosmic impulses, but each human has the free will to work with cosmic laws or to deny them. Rejecting natural law leads to divergency, where a soul can begin to fragment, degenerate, and eventually dissolve. When this occurs, the soul must go back to the very beginning of life in that solar system or in our solar system. Okay, so now we're going to get into the really, I would say, interesting part of this This is the really interesting part of, I would say, human evolution, and it's called divergency. Now, I've been talking about this for probably about a year, but I think it's good to discuss it now in context of the entire solar system and understanding what a life wave is, and understanding what a natural force, a natural movement through the solar system school is like, and then the unnatural divergent paths that can form that are outside of the rope of consciousness and outside of the life wave. Okay. So this is the rule or the law that is very important to understand. And it is that once you exit the life wave or the rope of consciousness, so if you do diverge, you cannot re-enter without some kind of sacrifice. So sacrifice is very important. And I'm not talking about, black magic sacrifices. I'm talking about a sacrifice from the sacrifice of your ego. So if you diverge and you get out of your life wave and you begin to degenerate as a being, as a soul, the only way that you can make it back into the rope of consciousness within your planetary sphere is if you sacrifice yourself, is if you sacrifice your ego. And that's also, even if you're not diverging, sacrifice is also a way, self-sacrifice and the sacrifice of the ego is also a way to evolve faster as well. So we have to understand what sacrifice is as a mechanism and as a purifier, and how it can help us to evolve and even heal ourselves. And again, this is a sacrifice of the ego, of your pain, of your darkness. This is not the kind of sacrifice that is associated with the dark arts, okay? So let's go a little bit deeper into what a divergent path of evolution is. So what is divergency? What does it mean if you begin to diverge from the rope of consciousness? Okay. If you alter yourself, your body, your mind, so that your essence is unable to resonate with the natural life wave, that natural organic impulse, the Christ impulse, you will be unable to enter it again. So we can't degrade or degenerate ourselves. So we can sort of degrade our consciousness through how we live, so that we can actually become so different in the quality of our being that we cannot incarnate into the life wave that we began in. We cannot incarnate into the rope of consciousness that we were in when we started our cycle. We sort of default from it. Now, this can happen naturally. So a lot of the divergent conversations we've had have talked about direct mutilations that we can do to our system. But the way that beings have diverged from their natural evolution has usually been naturally, and it is by fear. So by choosing fear repeatedly, the energy body degrades to such an extent it cannot take a human form. You could also call the human form the solar form. So fear will do that. If we live, and I'm not talking about, this is not to alarm people. I'm not talking about if you have a tendency towards anxiety or you have a temper or something like that, suddenly you're going to be out of the evolutionary path. That's not what I'm talking about. We all have our darkness that we have to assimilate. This is intense fear, intense fear, to the point that the higher bodies shut down. And there is such a dark energy in a person that they actually begin to turn their energy away from nature. So this is actually quite a prolonged state of fear that we have to be in if we're going to be creating a divergent path. You know, if you think of like, you know, the Disney villains or kind of the villains, they always look a little bit, they often look a little bit deformed. They often look a little bit mutilated. They often have animal parts attached to them, which symbolizes that they are reverting and degrading and regressing to an animal form or a beast form. There's usually something about their appearance that's a little bit off when you look at villains in movies or in Disney. And this is to symbolize the degradation of consciousness and how when we do degrade in our consciousness, we do end up taking a sort of different kind of body, if you will, or we don't really look human anymore, or our consciousness is not able to be in a human form anymore, or in the form that you could call the solar form or the body form that is made for the solar system, okay? The second way that we can leave the evolutionary path, the positive evolutionary path, is through physically altering your form in such a way that your higher bodies no longer connect with your lower bodies. So this can be done through transhumanism. You know, we think about the mark of the beast. We think about, you know, Neuralink. These kinds of things, what they end up doing is they are objects that can be injected into your body, and they can actually change your bioenergetic field to the point that your bioenergetic field is no longer natural. It's no longer biological. It's no longer organic. There's another force in it competing with it. And this can make you incoherent. And because there's a competing energy now in your system, you know, a chip or some of the transhumanism pushes that we've seen, what ends up happening is that it's not that you're not a spiritual being. You are and you always will be in a lot of ways. It's that you cannot sense your higher bodies. So your consciousness becomes hyper-materialized, and you cannot get your system aligned enough and succinct in its running to actually sense higher worlds. And so it's kind of like you have higher bodies, you have these higher spiritual bodies, but you're unable to integrate them. You're unable to receive wisdom from them. You're unable to communicate with them because the consciousness that you have, or the consciousness that is being created, once it's altered, is not balanced enough. It's got a different aspect in it that's competing with your ability to connect with spirit. And so that it can cut you off from your spiritual, from your emotional body and your subtle bodies. So this can also happen with chimeric mutations. You think about mixing human and animal. So anytime we change our structure, whether it be through transhumanism and adding machine parts, and by the way, I'm not talking about like a pacemaker or, you know, if you're an amputee and you have like a leg or an arm or some part of you, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about actual transhumanism, where the purpose of it is to basically interface with your mind or override the vibration, the natural vibration of your body. So if we do that, if we physically alter our form to an extensive degree, it's like playing God. It's like being a mad scientist. And we can actually cut ourselves off from higher worlds by doing that. Ultimately, the forms that we have, our human bodies took a very long time to form. And within them right now, they contain all the seeds of our evolution, all the seeds of our redemption, all the seeds of our awakening, all the seeds of our ascension. There's nothing that needs to be added or removed from the human being in order to make it evolve. We are perfect in that way, and that's why we call it the body temple. And that's why many of the ancient temples were actually in the shape of the human body, is because one of the ways that we understood the cosmos and what it was and how we made it tangible was that we saw that our own bodies were direct expressions of it, ones that were directly useful to us. So we have to understand that when human beings start to play God, when they start to merge themselves with machines, when they start to do chimeric mutilations to this heavy degree, we are not in the position where we are to create beings. Life forms and beings are created in a much higher dimension than we are now. We don't have the capacity to imbue creations with the intense high level of spirit that we have, because we, in a way, are in a degraded state within ourselves. So those are the two ways in which we can enter a divergent timeline, or that we can enter a path of divergency. So again, the first way is through fear, through holding fear and acting on fear to the point that it actually degenerates your being. You actually need to nourish yourself with love. You actually need to take time and nourish yourself with light energy. So that's how we get our chi and our ki, our prana going. You can't just completely misalign from your own chi, your own light, your own prana, and think that your form is going to just regen. How? If you cut yourself off from your higher self, if you cut yourself off from your heart, if you become imbalanced through too much fear, you're not going to get the life force that you need to nourish yourself and to regenerate your body, especially life after life after life. Okay. So this is why temple cultures and mystery schools always taught different ways to live, so that you were not only so that you were able to evolve. All of these spiritual teachings that we have on earth are so that we can evolve, and so that we can basically become the highest version of ourself. And like I'm mentioning in this lecture, there is a distinct structure to the cosmos, to our evolution. And there are laws, there are universal laws that we have with our body, where we can only go so far with it, with our consciousness in our body, before it will begin to get out of the natural evolutionary path. Because clearly there's a lesson that we need to learn when that happens. Okay? So when you do degrade and you do begin to take that evolutionary, the sort of divergent timeline, or the divergent evolutionary path, you will be trapped outside of the rope of consciousness. You'll be trapped outside of the collective consciousness of the earth. You'll still be connected to it. There will still be certain tethers of your mind connected to it, but you won't be able to enter into an incarnational cycle on the earth. So this is sort of a problem. So you're sort of outside the natural life wave of the planet. There are sort of even in earlier times, as we're going to talk about in Rudolf Steiner's work with Luciferic beings, even in earlier times, there's always this path of divergency, or this path of being held back in every single evolutionary phase, where there's always these consciousnesses, these beings, these souls, if you will, that they don't make the initiation. And in that way, they're held back. but they always seek to re-enter the human consciousness. They always seek to re-enter the life wave. They always seek to re-enter the planetary consciousness. They always seek, even though they didn't pass that initiation, they still seek to re-enter it. So there's this tension that happens between the human beings that are still part of the life wave, that are still within the rope of consciousness. They're still a strand within the rope of consciousness. They're not outside. There's a struggle that will occur between the beings that have exited the natural evolutionary cycle and the human beings that are still in it. There's a natural pressure that will occur there, a tension that will happen. And it's a tension that leads to our evolution, really. And we'll get to that a little bit later. If you exit the natural life wave, you will become paralyzed or stunted because you will no longer be receiving the life force energy from the wave. This is really important. So if through, and by the way, this happens through your own free will. Every single life that you have, every single moment that you're alive, you can either make a decision to align with, it sounds very silly, it sounds very simplistic. You can align with love, and you can align with your intuition, and you can align with your Christ consciousness. You can live from that place. You can run every decision that you have to make through that place. You can choose to throw away or, sacrifice whatever you don't want or need so that you can carry more of that Christ consciousness within your being. You can do that. We all have that choice, and everything great that's happened in your life has been because you've made that choice. Or, as beings of free will, we can completely go against that. And we can fall into the most negative beliefs imaginable. We can put ourselves down. We can put other people down. We can believe that might is right, that we're better than other people. And we can go down this very dark path. But when you go down the dark path, when you go down that path of fear, you will, just by doing that, you will starve yourself of life force. You will not be able to receive life force. And this is why you see the vampires. You see the vampire lore, or these different sort of villains that have to actually live off of human energy. They have to suck humanity's blood, or you see these various different even beings in the lower astral plane. How they live is that they eat fear, or they have to consume the energy of another being. And this is because they've degenerated their own consciousness through fear to such a degree that they can no longer connect with the higher forces of energy. When they do that, they just feel an amazing sense of pain. They just feel all the pain that they've never healed. So they don't want to go there. So they figure out how they can literally prey on people. And they try to set up systems and hierarchies where they can literally live off of people, live off of humanity. But that's from a place of complete and utter weakness, because we all have the ability to receive life force directly from God. We all have the ability to learn to clear ourselves to such a degree that we can actually feel that life force building. So that this parasitic element is very, very important with divergent beings, with dark beings, and with beings that are outside the evolutionary chain, because the only way that they can get energy is by imposing themselves on others. And the moment that they don't get that, the moment that they don't get the energy that they need, they begin to implode. Okay, so Once you're outside that evolutionary chain, you are no longer receiving life force from that life wave. You're basically facing a starvation. Now, there's a couple choices that you have once you're outside of the life wave, which I'm going to get into at the end. But what you're facing is basically starvation. You're basically going to implode unless you can get energy from other people. So you'll begin to degenerate. They'll begin to die. And of course, they cannot incarnate back into the rope of consciousness. They can't take a human body. And so they'll have to basically go back to the very beginning of the planetary experience. You have to go back to the very beginning of consciousness in the solar system. So a good way to sort of visualize this is if you can imagine that rope of consciousness that has all of these collective strings in it of the individuals that are making up the collective. And then you have a couple strings that are like outside of it, making up a different rope. So it's kind of like a separate life wave, a separate rope of consciousness that's outside of the organic one, that's outside of the collective one, that's outside of the one that actually leads out of this lower dimension into higher worlds. So the divergent streams, the divergent timelines, the divergent ropes of consciousness that are created from these beings that are divergent, they don't get to move on. Once an end times happens, and remember rule 2, which is that we're all subject to the same laws. So even if you're outside of the evolutionary, even if you're now on a divergent path, you're still subject to the same laws that everybody else is. So once the end times happens, that is their time of where they have to go back, unless they can find, well, we'll get into that at the end, but that is the time where they don't get to continue on. And once that rope of consciousness transforms into a higher rope, as it follows the life wave, certain elements of the solar system, as we know it from this Earth perspective, will begin to die. So once the life wave leaves the Earth and begins to move into a different planetary sphere, or it begins to move into a different sphere, the Earth goes through what's called a pralaya, or a night, or a sleep cycle, and it dies. And everything that was in this pocket of perception that we're in changes and begins to die. So all the planets shift at that time to take on different forms that match the new level of consciousness we are in. So if you're on that divergent timeline, you don't get to move on, obviously. And now the environment that you're in is going to die. And so sometimes with interdimensionals, you'll hear about planets being destroyed, and worlds being destroyed, or people being outside of their evolutionary cycle and basically looking to terraform all of these different planets just to try to survive. Well, you have to evolve with your planet. You have to evolve with the life wave of your planet. If your planet is destroyed, if you destroy your planet, you don't get to move on. You failed to understand what it is to be in sacred union with a planet. You've failed. If you fail to be in union with your planet, that means you've also failed to be in union with your own body, with your own mind, with your own form, because our form is an extension of the earth. It's the marrying of the earth and the sun, really, in a lot of ways. So we don't get to just destroy our planet and think that we get to move on indefinitely in the cosmos as gods. When the planet is destroyed, this is like failing a class. This is like failing a class, because again, we move through the solar system as a school. And so if we get to this point where we don't understand our place in our on our planet, we don't understand the bond that we have, and we just want to destroy it, this is a failure. And there's a lot of notions in, I think, the starseed community or in the New Age that don't really pay much attention to the laws of human evolution and the laws of our human evolution through the spheres, which is that you don't just get to abandon a planet, destroy a planet, and then move on as though you're gods, terraforming different worlds or whatever it is. Now, when beings get to extremely high levels of consciousness, they can help to be caretakers for certain planetary spheres, but those beings are not going to be in the 3D form, and they're not going to present themselves the way that I think many ETs apparently present themselves. So there are, we can talk about this another day, but there are sort of guardians of planets, and there are higher beings that are extremely advanced that do seek to make sure that the life wave of a world is in good shape to help humanity stay with their evolutionary path. So that they can evolve. Because remember, human evolution and our soul evolution is based on the last cycle. We move through many, 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 many cycles, going down in density and then up in density, and they're all compounding on the last one. You just can't walk out of one without losing the whole thing. You have to bring it to completion, which is in the Vulcan stage, which is kind of like an implosion into another world, really. So it's really important to know that our connection with our Earth is extremely important, and how we treat it and how we see ourselves connected with it, the connections we have with it, they tell us about how we feel about ourselves, and they tell us how spiritually advanced we are, essentially. And the real evolutionary path that leads to, the fifth dimension or the higher realms involves essentially staying on the Earth and staying with the Earth as it transforms into a higher body. And we do this through life after life, eventually taking bodies in higher forms. So our Earth, the spirit of our Earth, will eventually go into an even higher form. And if you look in your book, if we use the anthroposophical model, which I quite like, you're going to see that Earth changes into Jupiter, and then Venus, and then Vulcan. This is on page 8. So the Earth, the life wave of the Earth, which includes all of our souls, all of our spirits in that rope of consciousness, that moves through transmutation, conscious transmutation. We move into Jupiter. And then once we pass all of those tests, we move into Venus. And then once we pass all those tests, we move into Vulcan. And then we move into sort of a different phase of existence altogether. But we're not abandoning the Earth. We evolve with the Earth. The Earth actually transforms with us into another sphere. So this idea that we can just go terraform worlds, that we can just abandon our planet or dominate our planet and have it be whatever we want it to be, it's completely materialistic, it's completely reductionist, and it goes completely against cosmic law. And we will see that in the next couple hundred years as we see materialist science and these sort of bizarre views of the cosmos come to fruition. But we are in a chain, a rope of consciousness with our planet, and and with our sun, and we are moving all together. We don't get to abandon her. We don't get to abandon our world. We evolve with her. Okay. All right. So an example of beings that would technically be on a divergent path would be, and I've used them many different times before, would be the gray aliens or the gray ETs, and also certain chimera beings that are not actually alien. They're actually the result of human beings merging themselves with different animals in order to survive in different timelines. So there are certain beings that are in communication with our planet, and they're not actually aliens. They don't come from, Zeta Reticuli or this system or that system. They are literally human beings who have degraded their bodies because they are on a divergent timeline. And they're now trying to come back into the life wave. They're trying to merge back in with the planetary consciousness because they've realized that they cannot evolve unless they try to regain their old form that they damaged. And so there's actually many different beings that people will claim are aliens. They're not aliens. They are literally human beings like you and I who took a divergent path. They are from the earth. They're from the life wave that has led to the earth. They're from the same life wave that the earth is on. And they became divergent. And that divergency, again, you don't get that life force energy, so your form doesn't evolve, it devolves. So there's all of these different timelines, if you will, these divergent timelines of our own planet that come back, and they're so deformed compared to us, or they really often will represent one highly cultivated aspect of humanity. So you'll often hear about all these, interdimensionals or whatever that have, just one great ability or whatever it is. Like, the grays have this incredible mind or whatever, but it's at the expense of the emotional and spiritual bodies. This is what that path of divergency is about. Usually paths of divergency are created because a being is looking to develop itself in one way without the whole in mind. And so they start to change themselves and deform themselves because they want to dedicate to have one massive quality. They want to have this amazing mind. And in order to do that, they use the life waves evolving energy to evolve only that one part of themselves at the expense of everything else. And then they're divergent because we have to evolve in a balanced way without denying all aspects of ourselves. We cannot deny the emotional body and expect to evolve. We cannot deny the spiritual bodies and expect like we're going to evolve. We have to do it in a balanced way. So it's very important to know this. A lot of the people, a lot of the beings that, in the starseed community, people are calling aliens or ETs. They're not ETs. They're not aliens. They're literally divergent timelines of humanity trying to get back into the life wave on the earth because there is literally no hope for them otherwise. Big difference than thinking like, oh, this is an alien or whatever. So we're going to get into this a little bit more near the end about how they can get back in to the life wave, to the rope of consciousness. So if you are in a divergent form, you will incarnate into the divergent stream of life that you have created for yourself until you either transform it through sacrifice or until you disintegrate, until you go into the abyss or the eighth sphere, or until you you know, as Edgar Cayce would say, you get reamalgamated by Saturn. You go into the black sun corridor and you get reamalgamated. So that's how that goes. All right. And so what's really interesting about our human evolution is that it is actually really interesting when you think about it, that we can be incarnated on the earth and part of this collective consciousness. And then there can be beings that are divergent from the earth path. They're divergent from that life wave and they can be hanging around. They've diverged. They technically cannot get in. They cannot take an incarnation of a human body. So we're here on Earth, and literally there's all these divergent beings, divergent paths of evolution that are technically surrounding the planet, wanting with everything they have to get back in. It's pretty crazy that we can have this one path and then all these alternate ones around it for a period of time. So they sort of orbit us in a way. And you could even see them, like if you wanted to look at the big picture, you could see them as different versions of humanity, different aspects of humanity, different types of human beings that took a different path. Now, there are certain interdimensionals, there are certain ETs that don't fit into this category, that are what you would call more genuine ETs. But we connect with those types of genuine ETs at a different phase of our consciousness. We have to be at a point where we ourselves are more unified within and more connected and more spiritual. There's levels of the cosmos that open up to humanity depending on the consciousness that it has. And there are genuine experiences with what we would call genuine extraterrestrial beings that are not what I have described. They're not directly linked to the divergent paths that I have described. Why I'm not teaching that right now, or why I'm not talking about it, is because the vast majority of beings that we encounter, for example, in abductions, are aspects of ourselves from different timelines. And that's because it serves an evolutionary purpose for us to see ourselves in a degraded form so that we can choose the timelines that we want, so that we can choose the path of evolution that we want. That's why we see these divergent forms of ourselves. They're not really aliens, but they're not going to come to us and say, hey, you know what, I failed an initiation in the future, or I failed this initiation and now I want to come back in. They're not going to do that. They're going to lie to you, right? Now, that said, there's also different types of beings that are what you would call superhuman. So they're not divergent at all. They're actually from the exact rope of consciousness you're in, the exact life wave that you're in. They're just a little bit ahead. And you can see that in the Venus chain. You see, going back to page 8, you can see Earth is 4, Jupiter 5, Venus 6, Vulcan 7. So you get, there's a sweet spot where you can get an influx of beings that are from higher spheres. And Venus is the higher aspect of the Earth that come in to help humanity evolve. And again, these aren't aliens. Pleiadians aren't aliens. Venusians aren't aliens. They're not aliens. They are humanity from a higher dimension. They are human beings that have passed this initiation that we are facing today and that come back to assist us. For them, it's like going back in time. Time doesn't really work in that way, but you can imagine it that way. So it's a very interesting cosmos that we're swimming in, right? We've got these divergent timelines that are surrounding us, wanting to get back into Earth because their very evolution depends on it. Then we've got higher beings that are technically just from the higher version of the Earth. You've got the Venusians and the Pleiadians, which that's what they've called themselves over the years. They also associate with the sun because Venus If you look at the chart on page 8, you can see that planet 6, which is Venus, is parallel to the sun, which is planet 2 in our evolution. Saturn is parallel to Vulcan. So they have the same mechanism. So Venus has the same mechanism as the sun. Venus is the same mechanism for our soul as the sun is. And if you look at the spheres above it in diagram 2, and this is again still on page 8, you can see that the second chain from the left, that would be the solar chain. That has the exact same layout of dimension, density, and consciousness, that solar chain, chain number 2, as the 6th chain, which is Venus. So you can see that they're actually kind of parallel in their meaning. And also Saturn is also parallel with Vulcan. So they're not the same, but they're driven by the same mechanism, okay? So these higher spheres, like when you hear about Venusians or pleiadians, or they're just human beings that are technically from the future. They're not even really ETs. We just call them that because we don't have a very good language to describe things like time travel, or to describe how there comes a point where Earth will naturally overlap with the higher aspects of itself. And this often happens in a golden age. There are certain souls and spirits that will stream in from the Venusian sphere because it's this Goldilocks zone where it can really help Earth. Okay, so there are divergent beings that are surrounding Earth and connecting with Earth and trying to, divergent versions of humanity that we kind of call aliens. But if we were to look at who they really are, we would see they were divergent versions of ourselves, kind of deformed or mutilated versions of ourselves. But then we also have higher aspects of ourselves that are also assisting us. And these are literally, this is literally the Earth in a higher dimension that commingles with the Earth. So Venus will come down and commingle with the Earth for a certain period of time. There will be initiates exchange that come down. These are the great teachers. This is getting into the sleeping kings and all of that. And then it pulls away. But there's always a stream of consciousness from the higher spheres to the lower spheres as well, which serves as an even higher initiation point for the beings that are from them. And so this is the solar system is such a beautiful school of evolution. And part of that evolution is literally to face the divergent aspects of humanity and also the higher aspects of humanity. But they're not alien. It's not correct to say that they're alien. And if you believe that, we will be starting off on the wrong foot, because we will not, if we believe that these are all aliens and extraterrestrials and different from us and separate, we will not be able to truly understand them. And we will not be able to understand human history. And we will not be able to understand what karma we have with them. We will live in a broken off materialist version of the cosmos, which is where everyone is an extraterrestrial and we're just ourselves here. That is a materialist version of esoterica. Any being that appears here through the portal system that surrounds our planet has an association with it, is connected with it somehow. There's something with it that is of the Earth. Otherwise, it would not be able to perceive the Earth. There is so much going on within this universe that you can only perceive what you are. So, when a gray being shows up, when this being shows up, when that being shows up, what do? We ask, we say, what is your connection to the Earth? Why are you here? What is your connection to the Earth? We don't just assume that they're from another world and have no connection here, or their only connection is that they're gods or something like that. Their only connection is that we share one big cosmos. No. If they are seeing the Earth, if they are here, there is something in them that is of here, that is connected here. And the more connection they have, the more they want to connect, the more that is within them. And this is one of the laws of contact, of psychic contact, of interdimensional contact. This is a law of interdimensional contact. Okay, moving on. So we've covered we've covered divergency. Let me see if there's anything that I'm missing. So this is important. The divergent streams, they cannot form their own world. So once you diverge from the rope of consciousness, the organic life flow, you cannot just create a world from your little divergent stream. That's not possible. So all they can do is try to take over somebody else's world or terraform a world or force themselves upon someone or something else, but they cannot create a world from their divergent stream. Because energetically, their true life force energy is still attached to the earth, or their life force energy will be still attached to the planet in which they're from within our solar system, which would technically be a previous incarnation of the earth or a future incarnation of the earth. So whatever you remain connected, tethered to the place in which you fell from, or the planet in which you diverged from. You can't create a new world. You're always going to be of that world. You're just divergent of it. Okay. So once you have diverged as well, you have to follow certain cosmic laws to re-enter the stream. And that is consent. You have to get people, well, we mentioned surrender or sacrifice. That is one way, again, that you can re-enter. But another level of this that divergent beings have to take on in order to re-enter the organic stream, the evolution stream, is that they have to get humanity to consent. They have to get the beings that are within the rope of consciousness to accept them and to consent and to allow them. So they have to be invited. And this is also in vampire lore, where you hear the vampire knocks on the door, and if you don't let the vampire in, the vampire can't hurt you. He's forever going to be lurking outside your door. The divergent beings are forever going to be lurking outside the planet wanting in. But they will always knock, and they will always be looking for consent. And some of these beings don't have an emotional body anymore. They don't have any sense of morals. They don't have any sense of ethics. They actually sacrifice that to get a greater sense of mind, like we're talking about with the Greys. So they're trying to get their sensitivity back, but they need humanity to consent and invite them and accept them in. They cannot force themselves upon humanity. And so this is where you get all of the weird subversion that happens in order to break down human consciousness. You get people alive on the earth that start to serve these beings and align with these beings and try to make cases for these beings. They get manipulated by these beings, and the more consent that these beings get by humans on earth, the more they can try to force themselves into the life wave, or force their influence into our consciousness. And so there's all these different types of trickery and manipulation that goes on this planet on behalf of darker beings that want consent, and they try to trick humanity into giving them consent, into coming back here. And this is one of the huge issues that we have. We start getting into, people talk about like brainwashing, or like like how technology will put you in this like alpha sleep wave, and you start getting into all these kind of black magic versions where you get consent in backward ways through trickery. That is what this is sort of getting into. If you're not willing to admit you're wrong and come in a humble way, you have to trick people into letting you in, right? People who have not diverged and are in the rope of consciousness must be willing to take on divergent humans' karma to help them. So there are occasions where there are human beings or souls that have diverged and have been very humble about what they've done and can reintegrate into human consciousness through a mutual understanding and through a higher version of consent. All right, so now we're going to get into anthroposophy. And I found it really interesting that Rudolf Steiner talks about what he calls Luciferic beings. Luciferic beings. And these Luciferic beings are very similar to what we're talking about today with divergent beings. Beings, souls, people that are outside of the natural wave of evolution. They're divergent. So Steiner's talking about Luciferic beings that are technically outside the natural life of humanity, but still seeking to participate in it is exactly what I'm talking about. So in anthroposophy, these Luciferic beings or essences were once within the life wave of the earth. Specifically with the Luciferic beings, they were within the life wave when the earth was called moon, or when the earth was in a phase called the old moon. So that's when these beings diverged. So that's a different state of divergency than what I'm talking about, which is modern divergency. So this is beings that diverged in the old moon phase, an old phase of the earth that's called old moon, right before the earth formed. They reached a junction point and they fell out of step with natural evolution, and they diverged from the rope of consciousness. Despite this, they still continue to attach themselves to the evolutionary life wave of the earth and even to humanity itself, even seeking to live within humanity. Due to their divergency, they could not take a physical form. They could not take a body because they did not pass their initiation. So they had to stay as a non-physical entity or essence and live within man. And these Luciferic spirits could attach themselves to man's consciousness, and they try to live through us. They try to influence us. But they're ultimately, what's going on with them trying to enter human consciousness is that they're seeking to re-enter the life wave. They're seeking to re-enter a stage of evolution that they fell out from. Okay, so let's read what Rudolf Steiner has to say about this. The Luciferic influence arose because certain spiritual beings were, in their own development scheme, out of place versus the overall evolutionary scheme. More specifically for man, these Luciferic beings are pursuing their future development on Earth within man, because they could not achieve this on old moon. Therefore, on Earth, they are somehow out of place and bringing mankind certain benefits such as freedom, but also certain challenges. So the Luciferic spirits act as an initiating force for mankind. Just like how the more physical divergent timelines that we experience at this point are also sort of offering us an opportunity for growth as well. And with the Luciferic spirits, because their spirituality was from, their essence is from old moon, it's a very high, intense level of spirituality. So it gives us this feeling, it can give us this feeling of freedom. And that's what they offer us. That's kind of what they offer us as a good thing. But if these Luciferic spirits are not worked with properly within man, if man is not disciplined, then the Luciferic spirits can lead to the constant seeking of freedom at the expense of all order and the expense of everything in creation. It will actually destroy everything, always seeking to be free and always never want structure, and will lead to intense depersonalization until the individual is essentially destroyed. So this is the issue with the Luciferic beings. He goes on to say, we have repeatedly drawn attention to occurrences in evolution which must be traced back to those beings who have, in the course of evolution, remained behind. They did not pass an initiation. They diverged. They did not continue with the life wave. We know that the Luciferic beings have invaded the domain of our Earth, humanity. It has repeatedly been necessary to draw attention to the fact that these beings are able to enter our astral body during the development of our Earth because they did not, during Old Moon, reach the stage where they ought to have attained. A commonplace comparison has often been used that as in our schools, some pupils remain behind. So even in the great cosmic evolution, there are cosmic beings who remain behind in the stages of their own evolution. And they subsequently interfere with the evolutionary stages of other beings, with a result similar to that produced by the Luciferic beings who lingered behind on the Old Moon. So what is Rudolf Steiner saying here? He's saying here that there are essences or beings that are technically a previous version of humanity that can be left behind. And even though they're left behind, again, they still seek to connect with humanity because they still seek to evolve. But there's something about them that is imbalanced. So at this time, we're dealing with the same phenomenon as the Luciferic spirits that fell in the Old Moon phase that are seeking to re-enter humanity. That same thing is occurring, except we're on a different sphere now. We're on the Earth sphere. And there are aspects of humanity that have fallen, but they're not spirits. We're looking at real beings now. So where on the Old Moon is a higher density, it's a higher dimension to us. It's technically a higher sphere, not necessarily in development, but in makeup. And so they're just spirits kind of that we're interacting with. But when we start getting into the physical plane, they're not just spirits, they're actually beings or interdimensionals that we physically deal with because we're in a physical plane of existence. And so in our earlier development, we experienced them as just spirits, but now we're beginning to see these held back or divergent aspects of humanity as actual beings. And that's what happens when you sink very deeply into the material plane and you have that lower astral plane above us, is we see all of the divergency in which we have created. We see all that has been remained behind. We see everyone that has failed the classes in the material plane and even just above it, like in association with the Mars sphere and old Venus. We see all of those beings that have been held back, that are trapped in divergent timelines. We see that because we're now in the physical plane. So that happens all around us, and we see these as interdimensional beings. But many of them are beings that are held back. They didn't pass an initiation. Because when you're in the lower realms, when you're in the 3D plane and then the lower astral is above us, we're in a pocket of chaos. We're in a world of chaos. We're surrounded by chaos. It's the hardest school around. We must face our chaos and be able to put it in order to graduate out of this plane. And to do that, we have to understand the structure of initiation in the solar system. We got to know who is held back and why. We have to know when they're held back, how can they get back in? And if we do want to assist beings who are held back, how do we do so in a way that is empowering to us? And this may sound crazy to a lot of people, but I assure you, in the years to come, this will not be crazy at all. Okay, so this is very similar. The idea of the Luciferic beings that sort of can occupy man in our consciousness. This is it kind of strikes me as being very similar to L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology and his work on Thetans. And there's been other, like the Thetans that came from the volcanoes and entered humanity. That's very similar to Rudolf Steiner's. I mean, did he rip off Rudolf Steiner's work around Luciferic beings? Because what L. Ron Hubbard says in Scientology is basically, you know, these Thetans that were held back entered human beings and began having this malefic influence on them. But there's also other occultists that have mentioned this idea of these beings everywhere, from spirits and impulses that are technically held back from other aspects of our life wave, to actual beings, to ETs or whatever that are held back. So it's really interesting to think of things in this way and to put things in order in this way. And we have to begin to deal with these held back entities because they will always seek to re-enter the life wave. It's basically figure out a way to re-enter the life wave or be disintegrated and go back to the beginning. When you hear about all these, you know, elites that are obsessed with living forever and downloading their consciousness in a machine, this is completely repugnant to normal people. But for them, for people who are basically on the path of divergency or going to be in that path, have committed themselves to beings from that path and serving dark beings, that living forever is a way to keep themselves in the life wave and hold all the power that they have. Normal people don't fear. We may fear death on a very simple way. But this is such an intense fear of death because they fear leaving the life wave. They fear being in that divergent path. And in many ways, the darker beings in which they serve, you could even say that this is the higher aspects of themselves, or aspects of their own selves, if you will. They want them to live forever also and occupy this life wave. So this is what a lot of that living forever and projecting yourself into a machine is about. It's not about progress. It's literally about staying connected to the life wave, staying in the rope of consciousness, because once you leave it, if you've done a lot of dark and evil things and degraded your consciousness, to get back is very, very, very hard. Okay. So I'm going so we've been going for like 2 hours, and I want to do a lot of your questions. So I'm gonna blow through this last portion. So a modern example of the creation of divergent timelines is actually ancient Atlantis. So in ancient Atlantis, there were some scientist priests that started to go down a very dark path and play God. And they began to create these chimeras and merge human beings with different animals. And they did this actually not out of curiosity, but for a magical purpose. It's as a kind of divination, which I'll get to in a different lecture in the series. But they merged their DNA with different technologies and different animals, and they were just being these mad scientists. They felt like they could just create the cosmos themselves. And the beings that they created, because again, we cannot create a being from the third dimension. They're only a being that can survive the entire incarnational procession of the life wave must be created from a higher dimension. And then they fall with all the seeds of their rise within them, and then they catalyze themselves back up. So you cannot create life from the third dimensional plane like a being and then expect them to participate in the life wave. Because again, the life wave begins at the beginning up here in a higher dimension. We fall forming a specific body that's for the solar system, and then we rise. So you can't create a being from the third dimension. You just won't have enough life force in it. Even when a woman gives birth to a child, you know, that is from God. That being is not from her. She didn't just create it in her mind. she collaborated with God to give birth to that life. It came from a higher sphere here. You don't start here and then move around. This is the death plane. This is the densest death plane. So they didn't understand this, and so the beings that they created, they didn't have enough life force energy and enough genetic patterns that were awakened to survive and live good lives. They had large gaps in their consciousness because they were not created by God from a higher dimension with the full essence of the life wave, but by man out of selfish means. The beings that these scientists, mad scientist priests in Atlantis created did not have enough life force and solar codes upon their inception to fully participate in life. They were always set to expire and degrade, okay? What ended up happening is that the scientists that created these beings upon death found themselves having to take lives in those bodies. They found that they had bound their soul to these lower forms, And in order for these forms to survive, they had to be worked very closely upon. And Edgar Cayce actually talks about this in his writings about how to repair these forms and whatnot. But they will eventually die if humanity doesn't work to ensoul them properly, if you will, or work with higher hierarchies in order to potentially give them life. So these darker scientists became bound to their creations. They became bound via their soul to divergent pathways, divergent paths of life that were outside of the evolutionary rope of human consciousness. So genetic experiments like this that cut too deeply into the solar codes, too deeply into human life, can lead to degeneration of the soul, as we cannot imbue these creatures with enough life force from the 3D or 4D plane. We can't actually imbue it from this plane. And when this divergency occurs, there are two paths a soul can take to re-enter the life wave. The first path that we've already talked about, which is you can force yourself upon the life wave and the rope of consciousness that you have abandoned, that you diverged from. This can include taking DNA from beings that are still within the life wave. So if you find yourself outside on a divergent timeline and your physicality is degrading, you want to take genetic information and DNA to heal your body or to try to breed yourself back into the rope of consciousness, breed yourself back into the life wave so you don't have to go into the abyss and start all over again or face your karma, face all the evil that you've done. You want to try to avoid that by using that chimeric power of creation to try to, because whatever you create is a chimera, whether it be transhumanism or chimera, like your soul, part of your soul will go into what you create. So they started to do, so certain divergent beings started to take human genetics as an attempt to try to breed themselves back into humanity. And this can be mistakes due to transhumanism or due to chimeric modifications. But the ones that do this have too much of an intense focus on materiality, because it's not all about DNA and genetics. It's actually about the condition of your consciousness and your psychic pathways. If your psychic pathways are extremely tangled or damaged or smooshed in a certain way, it doesn't matter if you have the right DNA. You can have the most beautiful DNA in the world and you will not be able to light it up. You will not be able to actually get it spinning and going unless your soul is able to be big enough to light up that DNA. So just having, like, this is where the eugenic stuff and where, you know, just have really good DNA, just be like a purebred or whatever. It's really, you can't. You could have in front of you the most pure DNA that you think you can create. But if that soul, if that consciousness is not of a certain level of initiation itself. It will not light up that DNA all day long. It will not light up that DNA. It will not light it up. So it is the soul, it is the individual's consciousness that lights up the DNA, that takes on the higher forms that are available within our genetics. It's not just about genetics. And this is something that I feel like humanity needs to really learn, because we obsess over appearance, we obsess over physicality, and it really is more about spirit and soul. It really is. Okay. So one way to try to get back into, if you've diverged, one way to try to get yourself back into it is basically to try to steal by hook or crook, try to get back in, steal DNA, try to fix your genetic code that you destroyed through transhumanism or chimeric stuff. And you will need to present themselves to, in order to do this, in order to force yourself on humanity and basically harvest them in an attempt to save your own self from your mistakes, you have to present yourself as some kind of spiritual figure, as some kind of teacher. You're going to want to present yourself to humanity as a friend. No being that is divergent and outside human evolution is going to tell you, yeah, I messed up big time. I'm now basically going towards the abyss, and give me everything that you have and let me have your planet back, because let me have your planet because I've destroyed mine in my timeline. Give it to me. No being is going to say that. They're going to tell you a lie about who they are. And they're going to tell you that you have to reintegrate them into society. They're going to tell you that they're your parents. They're going to tell you that you are the result of hybridization. They're going to tell you a backwards truth. They're going to tell you that you're beneath them, that humanity is the result of all of these divergent timelines that created humanity, when in reality, humanity is the cosmic form, is the solar form of the solar system. And there's many beings that have diverged from humanity that seek to work themselves back in. And maybe some of them do in our future, but through very different means than many of these beings present themselves to us through the New Age movement or through ufology or whatever it is. There is a process of integration, which I will talk about now. But what about the beings that lie? What about the beings that seek to enter back into the life wave through lying, through saying that they're spiritual teachers? What do we do about that? So there's a lot of spiritual trickery. There's a whole scene of false light or demons and negative ETs, negative agendas, dark beings, and they'll try to appear as great teachers because their life depends on that, and they have no morals or ethics. They literally just want the genetic information of this planet. They literally have no planet. They're out there floating in the cosmos. They have no world, and they want this one. And it won't work out anyway because their consciousness is not fit for that trajectory to actually evolve. Okay. So in an attempt to heal themselves and begin incarnating into the life wave, they will trick humanity to thinking that they are gods. And that's one of the biggest things that I see going on, is all sorts of lies about human origins, all sorts of weird stuff that goes on that literally are false light beings that are, or just like I said this in my interview with Dark Journalist a few weeks ago, where it's literally like an AI computer talking to people, because that's when you diverge far enough, you literally don't have humanity. You literally try to consolidate yourself into like an AI presence. And by the way, I want to recommend people check out Dark Journalist's latest discoveries with Mars lately. He's been really doing incredible work. So please go and check out his latest reports on that, because they're really incredible. Okay. So this idea of the human going back to the beginning again, this in Cayce's work, this would be re-amalgamated in Saturn. You know, Cayce says with Saturn, he says, Saturn is for the souls that love to begin again, which is a really nice way of saying you fragmented way too much. You betrayed natural law. You did a lot of evil things. You can't incarnate again. And now you go back to the beginning. So that is what Cayce would call as going back. And again, you can see on page 8, you can see that Saturn is the first planet in our wave. So you go back to Saturn through the Black Sun corridor, and then you have to begin again. And that's what these divergent beings face, is going back to the beginning, the first sphere of Saturn. Okay. And in Hindu, in Hindu teachings and theosophy, and I believe in Tibetan teachings, the really old, good teachings, they talk about going back into the lower kingdoms of life. Christianity abandoned this as it was evolving, but that is what will happen to the soul. It will go back to the lower kingdoms if it degrades to the point that it cannot incarnate into a physical form anymore. They also must experience their pain and their karma and all of that, which is a lot of the time why they don't want to die. Okay, here's the last part, you guys. The second way that divergent beings can reintegrate into the life wave is through humble sacrifice and surrender. You see, God does not turn his back on you ever. Never. There's always, until the very last moment of your very last life, there's always a moment for redemption. There's always the ability to say, take this from me. What do I need to do? Who do I need to forgive? Show me what I have done so that I may transmute it. Show me the path back into love. Show me the path back into my true self. Show me the path back into harmony. Show it to me. God always walks with us and allows that. That is a force that is available to us all the time, every day, no matter how dark we go. It is always present. It is always with us, because that is the force that this solar system is made of. And it is us who turn our back on it. It is us who turns our back on God. It is us who turns our back on our heart. But it is always available to us. And so through humble sacrifice and surrender, if there is a being in a divergent timeline, what you can do is you can appeal to the higher hierarchies of cosmic development. So there are higher angels. There's different categories of angels that basically hold consciousness together. There's even hierarchies kind of similar to the Great White Brotherhood that will work with you. And they'll show you a path of incarnation that you can take to get back into the life wave. So basically what you have to do is you have to you spiritually commune with these hierarchies, whether it be afterlife or during life. And you offer to take full responsibility for everything that you've done. You take full responsibility for everything that you've done, and you're willing to look at everything that you've done to get you to where you are. And in exchange, you will enter a path of healing and reintegration. So you basically surrender, you ask for help, and then you'll get given, you'll work with these higher forces, these higher angelic, very high angelic forces, to give you a very specific life path that allows you to redeem yourself. And you will have, a spiritual team around you where you can process everything that you've done. And so this is always available to us, and it's available for all of the really nasty, negative, divergent beings today. I mean, there's no reason why dark entities should force themselves onto this planet and onto people and live parasitically off of us. They literally can just take full responsibility for what they've done and move forward and reintegrate that way, but they don't want to. They want to play God, and there's something very sick about that. There's something very, very sick about that, because it's not like once you're out, you're out. There is this pathway back in. So you'll go through certain incarnations and be given certain tasks to heal your karma and re-enter the life wave. The only thing that holds someone back from entering the life wave is their own ego. So the only thing that stops you from re-entering your evolutionary path is literally your own ego, your own desire to control, your own desire for power, your own desire to play God. So, all right. And I found this really interesting quote from Edgar Cayce, where he talks about that the human beings that have these chimeric qualities, so that we're sort of like half animal or automatons, he said that these, in Atlantis, that these qualities could be shed, they could be healed. So all of the dark stuff that the scientists did, and even the sort of weird forms that formed even naturally due to people's consciousness, kind of beastly forms in an earlier time, these could be shed and these could be reworked by sacrificing what he calls the lower desires and dedicating yourself to a higher cause, so that you could actually remove all of these influences from your being and incarnate into higher and higher bodies by dedicating yourself to a higher cause and by sacrificing these lower desires and getting out of the lower three chakras. And he says this, and this is from source reading 275:33. For in the period there was the temple of sacrifice, or that wherein the body was shed of the animal representations through the sacrificing of the desires of the appetite, through the changing of the self in the temple service. So in other words, there used to be temples in Atlantis that were working to heal these forms. And the temple was called the temple what? Sacrifice. And it involves sacrificing your lower urges for higher ones, sacrificing your ego for a higher purpose. And that's how all of these divergent aspects of the human form that were chimeric, that were beastly, or whatever it was, that's how they were healed. And there was a specific temple for it. All right, I am now ready for your questions. I'm going to be doing another lecture on this, and I'm going to be doing that one on my platform. So this discussion is going to be elaborated and continued on. It's going to be on my platform, but I will post it on YouTube shortly after. So I just wanted to let you guys know that whatever lectures I do in Star Wisdom, or whatever lectures I do in this vein, even if I do put them on my private platform, I'll always post them on YouTube a little bit later. But I just wanted to let you guys know that in case you want to participate live, and in case I forget to mention that at the end. All right. So let's see what you guys have for me in the line of questions. Oh, YouTube is not working, only Rumble. Oh, wow. That is interesting. Okay, so the YouTube stream doesn't work. Okay, well, I've just been talking and talking and talking. So hi, everybody on Rumble. Okay, this question is from Teresa. If a divergent being redeems themselves and re-enters the rope of consciousness, do they re-enter the plane frequency from which they diverged? Yeah, essentially they would have to do, they would have to do certain tasks that would be sort of not exactly where they were. There would be some, I guess, bridge lives or kind of bridge incarnations that allowed them to release certain energies to get them to the point where they once were. And then they would re-enter at the point, hopefully, where they once were. And move forward. That's what I understand. But there may be certain types of incarnations or certain types of like helping from the higher realms under the guidance of higher beings that have to go on before you begin to enter the 3D rope of consciousness. So yeah, and then once you can handle it, then you would hopefully begin to you would hopefully re-enter it. Okay. Gigi Oni, do grays try to reconnect to the rope of consciousness or disconnect us humans from the natural evolution and rope of consciousness? Is staying in high vibes helping stay invisible to grays? Yes. So what we understand as the grays there may be sort of different forms, but ultimately the grays are a product of transhumanism. This has been their form and the reason why they look the way they look, with the very large head, with sort of no genitals anymore, no hair. That was due to basically choosing the transhumanist path and various different efforts that they did in order to try to stay alive once entering that divergent path. So because of that, the grays do seek to re-enter the human stream. And this is why every abduction story with the grays usually has something to do with either harvesting genetics, harvesting DNA, or like birthing, like trying to create hybrids. So the idea with the grays is that they are trying to achieve something called, I believe, transgenesis, where ever since around the end of the World War II, there's been this incredible increase in sightings and abductions, and basically abductions by grays. And sometimes these abductions are mixed with military operations, because the grays, according to different whistleblowers and psychics, and what the lore is that they basically got permission in exchange for technology. And so they're trying to actually breed themselves back into humanity. And this is why you'll see a lot of people who really seek to channel the grays, and their spirit guides are grays. They're often really obsessed with like hybridization and having little baby grays, mixing humans and grays. That's because their spiritual connection is essentially an alien gray. And the alien grays their whole purpose of communicating is not primarily to uplift humanity. Their whole purpose of communicating with us is primarily to re-enter the human life stream, the human rope of consciousness, because they've diverged from it. And if they stay diverged, they will literally die. And so that's the reality with the grays. I think that we need to understand that, we need to look at all the information. And so they do want to disconnect us from our natural evolution, in the sense that they want to change humanity so that humanity becomes a vehicle for them to incarnate into. And that means that humanity actually has to be degraded. So the human being as it is not as technologically advanced as the grays. The grays are from a future timeline, so they have incredible technology, including the ability to communicate telepathically via technology. It's not a real spiritual telepathy. It's like a technology. Everything that they do that's magical is literally just technology, but we see it as magic because we're so far behind. We think it's spiritual, but it's really just technology. And so they actually seek to, in all of their abductions, they're actually seeking to modify humanity to a lower level of consciousness, to a lower form of consciousness. And that means that they can then try to incarnate into those bodies. because humanity as it is now is actually very high, very high vibration. And we contain within us, just so much power, all of the DNA that we have, like that junk DNA that we have, the junk DNA is literally just turned off because we're in a lower dimension. It turns on when we turn it on by transmuting our pain. We become higher and higher and higher. It's not there because aliens gave us that. It's literally our birthright that we got by moving down in density over time. And then we light it up as we ascend, but we light it up through transmutation. So they're trying to actually get our DNA because it's actually significantly more spiritual. And because we're in such a low state of materialism, they can actually perceive us and trick us for this period of time. And so they want to modify the human being. And they have been trying to modify human beings since after the war. And this is why several people have mentioned this idea of transgenesis with gray beings, and that, they're wanting, if they can lower our form and make our form a bit more synthetic and lower our consciousness, then that means they can maybe begin to incarnate here. And so for me personally, I see the vaccination, the intense push towards vaccination and adding these mRNA spike proteins. For me, that's a huge red flag, because if you look at the big picture and you look at divergent timelines and you look at the reality that in order for a being that has diverged to get back into the incarnational cycle, they have to modify the human beings that are within the rope of consciousness. And if they can get them by their consent, you consent to these activities, you consent to it. Even if they're lying to you, you're still consenting. But through that way, they can get back in. And so, staying high vibe, staying connected to your heart, and all of that helps you not interact with that. Honestly, just being educated, just being educated helps you with that. And by educated, I mean, being educated on everything that we're talking about, being educated on what interdimensionals are, why they're here, on our journey through the solar system as souls, on what a life wave is, on what a divergent timeline is. All of that helps us become aware of what's going on. So we're not just like subject to all of this confusing group of aliens that are just introduced to us one day, good aliens, bad aliens, whatever it is. We have to be educated, because the alternative is that one day the government or whoever, is just introduces us to like these interdimensionals or aliens, and we just believe them, because we have no understanding about the actual structure of the cosmos and the actual structure of contact and divergent timelines and direct timelines and how the spheres interact and all of that. We have no science for it. If we don't have a science for it, if we don't have a structure for it, we have no hope in being able to actually understand what's going on should any of these beings be thrust out in front of us. Okay, this one is from Kaya Kohan, or Kakyan. So it's the fourth dimension only, lower astral plane, or is there also a light aspect of the fourth dimension? I heard a lot that it is also this Buddha empty mind state. Yeah. So in the New Age, there's a lot of very bizarre interpretations of what 3D is, what 4D is, and what 5D is. There is an aspect of, so obviously 3D is the material plane. That's the material plane. It's the mineral, including the mineral plane. The fourth dimension is divided into two. There is an aspect of the fourth dimension that is called, in many other teachings, the lower astral plane. And this is sort of like it's sort of like a layer cake. In the middle of the middle of the astral plane is divided by a membrane, and then there's all these different beings within it that are called lower astral beings. This would be the demonic plane, hell, purgatory, and it's when a being is so fragmented that they're not whole enough to pass through that membrane into the upper astral plane. And so the lower astral plane, and even to a degree, the upper aspect of the 3D plane, they are catch-all for every divergent being you could imagine, from, you know, the Mars to lower aspects of past aspects of Venus to other divergent beings that are summoned here from other universes or whatever it is. It's all within this lower plane because there's a certain amount of coherency you have to have. And when I say coherency, I mean you have to be coherent in your Christ consciousness. You have to be coherent with the sun. And that's what allows you to break through the membrane of the lower astral into the higher worlds. So without that coherency, you remain trapped in the lower astral plane in what would be called divergent timelines and in various states of divergency. But at the same time, like, some people get really carried away and say that the fourth dimension is basically only like darkness or only like duality and only polarity. And that's actually not the case. It's really just time. It's really just, it is, the fourth dimension will actually be whatever your level of initiation makes it. Most people, when we talk about the fifth dimension, most people we're not in the third dimension. We're not actually, our psychic circuitry actually isn't developed enough to contain what a lot of people would call fifth dimensional energy. It's extremely cohesive, high energy. So a lot of what people think is 5D is actually the upper portion of the astral plane that is heavenly, that is nothing like the lower astral plane. So a lot of people I think are sensing the division a little bit differently. Yeah, because the fifth dimension technically is like the completed version. It is completion, you know. So yeah, the fourth dimension is not like a negative bad thing. It's literally just, it can be the Buddha mind, and actually I think that's actually a really good a version of it, because the 4D plane is also associated with mind and the mental plane and just mind activity. And when you're in the Buddha level, it means that you are empty of mind, or that you are, you're not empty of mind in like a deficit. It's an emptiness of mind that's actually full of higher energy, but it feels empty because it's not full of lower energy that we're used to. So often what we feel like is emptiness is actually us carrying very high vibrational energies in our body, but they're so high we're unable to recognize them, so it feels empty. This is why mindfulness meditation is so good, is because you're essentially saturating yourself with higher energies. Okay. Avicea. During this evolution period, will there be a physical timeline split to new Earth? If it happens over reincarnations, do we only enter into higher timelines through death? Yes. How does it split? Yes. This is a really great question. So we know from our ancestors and through many of the mystics that have come before us that we are actually in a time of bifurcation. And this happens when we reach an end time. So in the booklet on page, I believe 8, you know, you're seeing that we move into these different spheres of development. And during the end time, you start to rise in energy. But, you know, as many of you know, not everybody will be able to shed themselves of their egos and rise in energy. There's always going to be some individuals that cannot make the initiation, and so they go into the 8th sphere, or they're kind of on this artificial path of divergency. And how that works is that the it works life after life after life. You incarnate into a, I guess you could say like a version of this earth that is akin to where your soul is. And over time, you either go up into the higher earth or you go into more and more divergency. And it does happen over time. It is a natural, it happens through a natural evolution over time. It's not like it happens right away. There have been solar events or certain things that have happened that have really affected the life wave or really affected the rope of consciousness in the sense that there were huge shifts and things like that. But the actual transmutation of the earth into a higher and lower sphere is happens over a long period of time. Eternal growth. Can we organically flow with the life wave by rejecting transhumanism? Yes. Yes. This is why I rattle on and on and on about transhumanism, about Mars, about grays. And sometimes, you know, when you're at an end time, you can boil down the initiation, which means that when you're at the end of a cycle, you can actually look at it and say, what is the lesson that we need to learn? What directly is the lesson? You know, if humanity takes this timeline, what becomes of it? What becomes of humanity if they take the transhumanism path? What becomes of humanity if they don't? And so that is the direct initiation that we face. It is technology. It is having a healthy relationship with technology, which means basically not projecting our consciousness into the metaverse. It means not projecting our consciousness into machines. That's devolving. That's devolution. That's degeneration. Just like the scientists in Atlantis that we talked about that felt like, you know, I'm just going to merge with machines and create all these chimeras, not realizing that a portion of your soul will go into that. And if it's too far away from natural order, it'll be very difficult to get it out. And so transhumanism is one of the biggest challenges that we face. And so by simply rejecting transhumanism, by rejecting things like the metaverse, or at least having a healthy relationship with it, by having a healthy relationship with technology, by using technology but not have it use us, this is passing the initiation, and that is naturally flowing with the life wave. Is there also much more spiritual work to be done to pass this class on Earth? Well, there's always a collective initiation, which I would definitely say is deeply tied into transhumanism and technology. But every individual has a personal karma. So like, you know, dealing with transhumanism, I also think dealing with interdimensionals that are divergent properly, because we're going to become more and more psychic naturally. There's an opportunity there. So part of our initiation is also not just technology, but also understanding how to discern entities. Where do they come from? Which is why I spent so much of this presentation on understanding divergent and direct evolution. So there's also a portion of it that is very psychic, which is discerning good and evil in people, but also good and evil in entities, right? Understanding that, being able to discern that. That is literally the difference between being a child and just accepting any adult that you see and being an adult, which is like, no, I don't prefer this. Who are you? And actually having a mind with you. Okay. And beyond the collective initiation, which would be transhumanism and discernment and sovereignty, we also have our individual karma that we have carried with us life after life into each rope of consciousness through the life wave. We have our own karma that is, you know, that's just ours. So we're also dealing with that. Okay, this is from Vanessa Lacoon. You spoke about our ability to connect to cosmic spheres. Can you recommend any practices, tools, or ways that we can become conscious of our personal connection with the spheres. Yeah, well, actually, astrology is a good thing to learn about your personal connection with the spheres, because your natal chart is literally your being in time space. It's literally you. It's this, when you look at your natal chart, this is when you look at the sign, the house that Mars is in, this is telling you about what the planet Mars is for you and how you're relating to all of your karma on planet Mars. Same thing with Venus and Saturn. And of course, the outer planets like, Saturn, those are also more distant to us now. And the inner planets are more, they have more pull because also the incarnations on them are closer, right? So astrology is amazing. Also astrotheology, which is the study of religion as the cosmos incarnating, is also very good. You can also do direct meditations where you take a planetary sphere and you focus on it for like a week, and you say, I want to know what is in Mercury. I want to know my connection with Mercury and Venus or whatever it is. And you just work with it for like a week, and you can even make like an altar if you want, and you can make it really ceremonial in that way, or you can just have a period where you just meditate, because the reality is we are so connected to the planetary spheres. They are literally different classes we can take. When that all we have to do is just set our focus on it. And we have to keep in mind, though, that there's going to be aspects of the planetary spheres and even some of the distant stars that speak to us, like say Sirius, the Pleiades. There's going to be aspects of them that we're just not going to grasp. And that is because we are not technically on Mars. We're not technically on Venus. And certain people will have stronger connections with different spheres because they've been part of a life wave that has come from that sphere recently. That's part of their life wave. That's part of their journey through the solar system. And that could be technically at a different time than you, even though we're all on this one rope of consciousness now here on this planet. So you just have to tap in, however that may be. But keep in mind that the information is going to come to you in our earthly language, using our earthly symbology, and it'll be kind of an earthly version of it, because we can't actually fully see with the eyes of, Mars, or with the eyes of Moon or Venus or whatever it is. All right, G, what is the correlation between the solar form, human bodies, and mammalian beings on Earth? Well, yeah, this is a really great question. So the human body is really a solar form. And we call it the solar system because in a lot of ways, the perfected element exists in the sun or in the solar logos. And all the planets that we see and experience are kind of like a different expression of the solar logos in a different time and in a different condition. And thus they represent humanity in a different time, in a different condition as well. So we therefore sometimes call our form a solar form, because that's where it really originated from. And this is why we also see all the beings that come from the Christ stream or the Christ impulse, like Jesus. We see them as solar deities or perfected deities, because they have a high level of that solar force developed within them. But Venus is also very close to the sun as well, an aspect of the sun. So so the mammalian being is very unique, because the mammalian being comes around when human beings really start to develop the heart and a certain level of empathy and sensitivity. And so that mammalian energy, that heart level energy, is very, very important in creating the human, the solar human, or the human form. And when I say creating, I mean that, as I said earlier in this lecture, the human form is being created in every globe that we incarnate into. Remember on page 8, there's all those different globes that we're moving through. Our form is being adjusted and created in every single one of those globes until we're now here in the densest, most condensed version of it. And our form is a temple. It is divine. It is representing the solar logos in all of its glory. But our form is still evolving. And so we need that hard energy that we really associate with the mammalian kingdom, and that empathy and that connected and that feeling of interconnectedness and just that heart warmth. We need that to actually evolve our form into higher forms. So they're very, very connected. Without that mammalian energy, we would not be able to have that sense of interconnectedness, that sense of empathy, and that sense of connection. Okay. All right. This one is from the Metal Valkyrie question. If these beings we come in contact with are us, how come we cannot recognize it as ourselves? Well, there are definitely certain people who have recognized these beings as themselves. And that happens when you become very, very fluent in intuition. So there's this flip that happens within every human being where when the intuitive bodies become highly developed enough, they become just as loud and just as input giving as your 3D senses. And in that case, what will happen when you're really psychically attuned is that you won't just look at a person and see that person as an individual, or see that entity or that ET being as an individual. You won't just project what you think that being is or believe what they tell you they are. Your intuition will begin to actually read deeper into that energy, and it will start giving you impressions on who they actually are. So your intuition will start giving you more information, and all that information will be, in a large way, how it relates to you, or with interdimensionals, how it relates to the earth, how it relates to you, information that you need, because intuition is really survival. A lot of intuition stems from what you need to know in this moment to make a good decision, right? Unless you're, taking time to use it to explore or something. Like if you're just meeting an entity, your intuition will give you a read down of that entity if it's developed. But we are in such a stage of materialism within our consciousness that, we see a being and we don't get the deeper levels of it. And we are very easily manipulated, or we will just project what we think it is, or we'll be weak-minded and be able to be tricked and things like that. But it all comes down to not having those spiritual forces developed in us that allow us to see deeper into what the actual history of a being is, the actual motives. It's discernment, right? You have to have a very spiritually developed system to discern, which is what we don't have on this planet very well. And that's how we know the beings that are extremely connected to us in timelines. Like they're very close to us. They're divergent timelines, but they're really interact with us a lot. But there's also beings that are not very connected to us, that are truly more alien, that are truly more disconnected. And we can recognize them for being more disconnected when we become more intuitive. And we have to train ourselves to do that. We have to train ourselves to see interdimensionals properly, right? And also, I think a lot of it too is that they don't look like us. And a lot of humans that took a divergent path, especially if they did so through transhumanism or through merging with like a lizard DNA so that they could be more robust, or merging with like an insect DNA to be more robust. As soon as you start experimenting with that, like Elon Musk said the other day, he was like, synthetic DNA is incredible. You can basically turn yourself into a freaking butterfly. Well, if you're trying to colonize all these worlds, the human mammalian form is very, very sensitive, and it needs a very specific environment to exist because it's so sophisticated. But you can revert back to an insect form or a lizard form that's sometimes more robust in certain ways. And so we don't recognize it because literally they're splicing their genetics with other beings. They're only part human. Or they've literally spliced their DNA with machines to the point that it just feels so unnatural to us because we're using ourselves as the springboard. It just feels so unnatural to us that we don't see it as part of us. But if we were to look at how they became that way in their entire trajectory, we would see that they were once human. So, yeah. Deborah Blair, what about the Rosemary's baby rituals being done by Big Pharma in the 50s, 60s onwards? Are these possessed at conception humans able to get free? And what if they have worked to harm? And what if they have worked to harm? This is such a good question, Deborah. So this weird idea of transgenesis, or this idea that there are human beings that are basically serving dark gods. They're literally serving lower astral entities, usually for power or wealth or some cheap hypnotic form of control. And part of them serving these dark beings that probably are divergent in some way is that they have to create these breeding programs. We talked about it with the abduction phenomenon, which is really more direct. But there's also these rituals that usually get done that allow for these dark entities to try to take a human form because naturally they can't. And so they engage in these weird breeding programs to try to incarnate these dark gods, but you have to create kind of an empty vessel. You have to create kind of this perfect mix of like empty human. Because if there's too much emotional energy, if there's too much of a certain spiritual quality, the soul won't be able to come in. And so there is a whole thing, like, let me tell you, you'll start looking at things like Lebensborn or, certain intense breeding programs and eugenics. And, how much of these breeding programs is not just about some idea of purity that people have, but how much of that is also being used to literally incarnate lower beings and modify the human form to a less spiritual state, to a lower state, an unemotional state, a clouded state, so that lower beings can begin to incarnate, so lower beings can take a form. As I said, there's always redemption. There's always the path out. No matter where you are, there's always a path out, but it's not easy. You have to take full responsibility for what you've done, for what you've participated, and you have to look at it. And then you have to take lives that balance out that karma, which are not easy. So it's much easier to try to avoid working with the higher hierarchies on a reincarnation path to heal yourself. It's much easier to try to force your way into humanity again, and maybe even take over humanity and feed on it. We have to begin to see this aspect of it, especially in our day and age where we are being subject to really bizarre vaccine mandates. I'm sorry. We do not need an mRNA vaccine for a virus with a 99.9% survival rate. Kick me off whatever platform you want. We don't need it. What is going on? Let's factor in esoterica. Let's factor in divergent timelines. Let's factor in the myriad of beings that are in the lower planes that are looking to incarnate here, but they cannot because of their degraded state. They must degrade humanity or create degraded lines in which they can incarnate. Otherwise, it's the abyss and Saturn for them. This is the reality. It's the reality that not a lot of people want to talk about, but it is. What is going on with Rosemary's baby? Is it just as simple as wanting to incarnate some nasty demon? Is that it? It's just fun? What's really about that? Are they trying to incarnate a line? Are they trying to lower the entire planet to a certain degraded state so that they can get back in because they've diverged? Okay, this one is from CWLSN. How do we help wake others up to this information? Can we? It feels so important, but it feels like many would think it's just crazy. Yeah, the vast majority of people, even the most educated people, even people that seem so educated in certain areas, they really can have a hard time with the esoteric stuff. A lot of that is because they haven't had enough experience in it. Let me tell you, if you have not had, honestly, there is a certain luxury in not having had a spiritual experience that just knocks your socks off to the point where you have no choice but to believe and understand the esoteric world. A lot of people who come to this information, a lot of you here this evening, came here because you've had experiences in your life that have not allowed you to have the luxury of not believing in the spiritual world. The luxury of not believing in the spiritual world. This is not an easy path to walk. You walk beside humanity in a lot of ways. And only when the chaos of the outside world matches the chaos of their inside world will they begin to tear off their materialist shrouds and begin to ask questions. But until you get that balance, until they are challenged, they will not turn to this path. Why? Because fundamentally, esoterica and spirituality is responsibility. This whole lecture that we've been doing this evening, this is all, how do you get back into the rope of consciousness? How do you get back into the life wave? How do you get back into the organic evolution? It's through surrender, sacrificing the lower urges. And that's actually also how you understand this material. How you understand this is you have to say, I'm willing to suspend what I think is reality. Even if I've made money from it, even if I feel like I can't, I'm willing to suspend what I think my cosmology is in order to potentially take on a truer one. And so once you enter the spiritual journey, you go through a much faster procession of life and death. You go through a very fast cycling of death and rebirth because you're always going to be challenged to let go of your ego. So long story short, this information is incredibly important, but people are not going to come to it until A, they've had an experience where they have no choice but to understand it, or like a direct spiritual experience, or B, they will have to experience external chaos and challenge and pressure and pain to such a degree that it's greater than their inner pain. And that will destabilize them. And then they will begin to reformulate their reality, but only because their reality had to completely fall apart in front of them to begin with. But the good thing is that everybody's on this path in a different way, and that's okay. What the most important thing is that when people come to us and they say, hey, I'm wondering about reincarnation, or hey, I'm wondering about masters, or I'm wondering about my soul, that we approach these people with the same loving, nurturing curiosity and appreciation and compassion that we wish we had had. So may we meet everybody with the compassion that we wish we had. And everybody who wakes up is a blessing. And we must be willing to lovingly take people on who are willing to grow, and certainly not try to punish people or call them unwoke or call them behind. Or no, if somebody's willing to come and walk this path with us, then let us be good custodians of it. And so that is the prayer. And it is hard. And we have to keep that in mind, that every new set of eyes that is open is good. And every heart that becomes devoted to the path is also good. It doesn't matter how or when they get here. Okay. All right. Akiri Nino, can we in this life incarnate Venusian aspects of ourselves? What does it mean to come to terms with our multidimensionality? Okay, so coming to terms with our multidimensionality means to understand that we are more than a physical body. It means to not abandon ourselves and hide from spiritual realities. You know, for a good example is like when we're dreaming, we're not just sleeping and our brain is just firing off random synapses and we're just, ooh, that's so weird. You know, it's so weird that I made a teapot hat in my dream and I rode around in a tiny wagon. Like these weird things that we do in our dreams, like, you know, that's not just our brain firing synapses. That, you know, even our dream world is our relationship with the astral plane. It is a spiritual act to dream. The way that we breathe, for example, is an opportunity to observe our multidimensionality, because we take in life force energy when we breathe. The way that we hold our spine allows our body to literally become more balanced. So how we come to terms with our multidimensionality, how we accept it, is to realize that every physical thing we experience has an interdimensional counterpart, or is connected to a higher aspect of ourselves, is also a mechanism of higher worlds, and that we are not just sitting, you know, in the material plane and that's it. That is how we come to terms with our multidimensionality. Can we in this lifetime incarnate Venusian aspects of ourselves? 100%. I have a video that is called, I think it's just Venus, and then in brackets a bunch of different topics. I get into this topic directly. Actually, my Venus videos get into this topic directly, how Venus connects with the Earth. Now remember, Venus is a future sphere, or a more advanced planet within the life wave of the Earth. It can be seen as the fifth dimensional Earth, or it's not exactly overlapping, but it's seen as the higher Earth. It is the twin sister of the higher Earth. Now, the reason why it's not Jupiter is because female and male planets have a little bit of a different energy, which I'll get to later on in this series. So Venus being a female planet is overlapping directly with the Earth, where Jupiter being a male planet is not expressing itself in that same way. Okay. So, and that's also why Mars is not overlapping the Earth. It's because Mars is a male planet. Those are evolutions. They're not direct store banks like the female planets are. I don't want to get too with the Venus thing, but so the Venus will actually come and overlap the Earth at certain times. And we will experience direct soul streams from Venus, we will incarnate directly from Venus. And there are also certain bloodlines that are Venusian that were formed in order to keep the Earth connected to Venus. Okay. But when it comes to connecting with the Venusian aspect of yourself, that process will often happen naturally for you. You'll see yourself in that form, or you'll begin connecting with these aspects. We can have a different video on that because it's so intricate, but you can absolutely connect with the aspects of yourself on Venus, the Pleiades, these higher levels, and you can channel them and you can connect with them and you can imbue your system with the energy. I really recommend just being dedicated to, in my life, I've found that the best approach is just to be dedicated to your health, to your well-being, to breathing, to meditation, and to really just let whatever shows up, show up, and to follow your heart and to interact with it. I find that to be the most powerful way. Sometimes that's more powerful than trying to reach out and force connections. Although for exploratory purposes, it can be very good to get a sense of each individual sphere by reaching out in an exploratory way. But there is something to be said for the natural chain of contact that every person has with these sort of different versions of themselves, or even different interdimensional beings or guides that we have. There's a certain power in learning to receive what is already there and learn your identity through that way. I hope this is making sense. This is from Katie Cat 9, could the fourth plane be the higher self? Yeah, so actually, the 4D plane is sort of it's, even if you have like a higher being, they're still going to come down to the 4D plane and project downwards. So they don't really project directly from the fifth dimension. They come down to 4D and then they project into 3D. So yeah, you could see that there is an aspect of your higher self that is on the fourth plane, and that if you connect with that plane, that it will begin to change your consciousness in a certain way as well. It's really the plane that like 99.999% of people interact with. Most of the like 5D stuff is projected downwards into a specificity that exists within the fourth dimension. We wouldn't actually understand a lot of the 5D archetypal language because it's complete and we're incomplete. So usually we can only see aspects of the completed essence that is in the higher realms. We just see pieces, and that is projected downward from technically the fourth plane or 4D. It's a plane that still has the archetypes that we use. Whereas if you go too high up in dimension, it becomes too completed, and a lot of the nuance to us we won't be able to see, not until we're completed. I hope that makes sense. Okay, Nixon. Nixon, 591 Nixon. How do the spheres relate to the dimensions? So every sphere, if we go to our book, you'll find, if you research this, you'll find a bunch of really like interesting diagrams. You'll sometimes find that the spheres are associated with the chakra system, and that the chakra system is associated with different dimensional planes. But if we go to our book, and if we go to that page 8 again, you can see that Earth in the lowest sphere is really 3D. And see, it's not exactly necessarily how the New Age sees dimensions. Sometimes in ancient literature, it's divided into sort of different qualities, like the physical, emotional, mental, intuitional, and spiritual. And those planes don't directly connect with the dimensions necessarily. But for example, you can see that the Earth is pretty much physical, and the farthest up it goes is mental. So the farthest up the Earth chain will go is sort of like the middle of the astral plane. And then the next incarnation, which is Jupiter, is going to be, it will never be as material as we are now at its lowest point, and it goes up. Well, every sphere is technically spanning a certain set of densities. Remember how earlier I said that Venus and the sun technically have the same makeup of density. They're technically making up the same dimensional space, if you will. And Saturn and Vulcan are also sharing the same dimensional makeup, but it's a little bit of a different mechanism that's driving them. But they're parallel in the densities that they occupy. Does that make sense? So once you go through the sun, I think a good way to look at it is like the sun, you can often see it as really representing the fifth dimension. And then, so once you pass Vulcan, or once we kind of fell from that plane and we pass up into it. So once you come out of Vulcan, you could say that you're going into the fifth dimension. But I hesitate to really allot a dimensional makeup to this, because I find that in the spiritual community, the language of dimension and density and the gradient of the cosmos is not decided upon. So you'll have some people that say we live in a 12-dimensional universe. Others will say we live in a 9. Others say 7. And so the most important thing, I think, is perhaps to call it the way that the older mystics did and associate it with qualities. But yeah, that's what I would say there. If you look at the old theosophical drawings as well, you'll see, and maybe anthroposophical, but I know with theosophy, they directly have drawings of the planetary chain, and they show you what is in 3D or physical matter. And then they show you what's kind of in the lower astral and the upper astral, but I think they call it emotional and mental. And then they show you what's in like the spiritual or imagination plane, which would be like the completed plane or 5D. So if you want to go to your Google Images search and just Google Theosophy Planetary Chain, you'll find all of these different drawings, you know, from the 1800s, 1900s, where you'll see the planetary chain, and then they'll have different markings on them that delineate what plane the planet is technically in, what plane the planets are in relationship to, you know, where we are. Okay. All right. Can someone be reincarnated divergent being and not know it? Yeah. We can, I think that you could make a really good argument that part of our journey as human beings is literally to diverge away from our life purpose or our path and then re-enter it. Now, there are states of divergency that are extreme. And when that happens, there's probably no re-entering the plane. There is a point of no return where you can be just like too far gone. And then you have to go back to the very beginning and incarnate literally as like animals and insects, and you have to literally restart. And there's been, you know, Samuel Ainwar talked about this in, I believe, his book on psychology. He talked about how he saw himself. He'd reached quite a high plane of evolution, and he actually fell. He became corrupt, and he actually fell back and had to begin again. He had to go all the way back to Saturn, and then he had to take on, you know, kind of a mineral life and kind of an elemental life, and then he remembered himself being a frog, and then an animal, and then in the mystery schools they say that the soul's last life, moving up from the kind of mineral and plant animal kingdom, the last 4 kingdoms of life that you take as an animal are horse, elephant, cat, and dog. So once they say that the ancient Hindu theosophy, Tibetan, like that really old Atlantean knowledge, they say that once the soul reaches those kinds of animal lives, which are funny because they're animals that are total companion animals for humans. So you can kind of see like, oh, I see why, because, you know, you kind of serve the human. You're kind of a companion of the human. No other animals are really companions like that. And that's why sometimes, you know, when you look at a cat's eyes or a dog's eyes, you're like, that is a person. That is a person in there. Or a horse. Like this is a person. And there's a lot of people who will love dogs and cats and horses and even elephants, and they don't realize it, but they're actually helping the souls of those beings take a future human life. They're actually initiating those souls into a human life. So we are initiating, the idea is that we are initiating those back into the human kingdom. Now, the Christian church does not like they does not acknowledge that, and a lot of people don't acknowledge that sort of, but that's fine. That is the teaching, is that you would evolve. Those are the 4 last species that you would take a life in, and then you would begin incarnating in human bodies. So yeah, that's how you would reincarnate from the bottom up again. And you imagine, I guess that would be very valuable. I mean, ultimately, it would be very, very valuable lessons. And we all become divergent from our path, and even divergent from God at certain times in our life. And we trust me, we all have incarnations where we went to the dark side to varying degrees. But you know, if we're here and you were born on this planet and you're a human being, you were, you know, you made it through, you're in the life wave. So, but yeah, we definitely diverge. But again, the more you diverge, the harder it is to get back in. This one is from Jack Robs a Bank. If someone takes the vaccine and he go to the Antichrist stream, the degenerate earth, yeah, the esoteric conversation around inoculation has been a really interesting one, because again, you know, there's so many interesting conversations around what happens when you change your genetics. How does that affect the spirit? Of course, you know, Rudolf Steiner wrote about vaccination. Manly P. Hall wrote about the dangers of vaccination. So vaccination has always actually been a conversation for the spiritual community. This is nothing new. There's always been people in the spiritual community that have made arguments that vaccines degenerate or can lead to degeneracy. And I found that very interesting. But I think that it's a very personal case. I don't think we're going to understand what all of this program of vaccination is about until like a decade has passed. I don't know. It's not clear to me that everybody is getting the same vaccine. There's been a lot of indications that there are different degrees of the serum that is being injected. We just really don't know what's going on with it. We're so new to this. As many of you know, I'm very skeptical of it, just because my background in the past few years has been so into understanding transhumanism and things like that, that when this happened, when I saw this, you know, this rollout happening for me, it was just like, oh my God, it's happening. Because I had been studying this for a year and a half before and reading about it. And so when it was happening, I was like, oh my God, big no for me. But I think that said, we're still very early in it. And I think that the biggest danger is what I mentioned earlier, is that there could be a change in our genetics that is technically degrading for us, where it actually makes us less spiritual, or makes it so that we can't, it changes our bioenergetic field and our personal consciousness to the point that we can't actually sense our higher bodies, because we've created this competing process that's just creating all of these spike protein crystals. And crystals are a resonance, by the way. Crystals are resonators. So there's this inorganic synthetic process that's now going on within our bodies that affects our bioenergetic field. That's adding something that's going to make it harder for us to connect, right? You can't diverge from your organic nature. If there is healing to be done, if there is something that needs to be addressed, it comes through, first and foremost, understanding it spiritually. And this is where the Eastern traditions are quite good. You don't really want to look at an illness as being solved exclusively by some kind of physical means. You want to work with basically every type of natural spiritual means you possibly can. And then if there is a more allopathic way, maybe include that. But this seems to be just like so much overkill. And we have to wonder why. Again, why are we looking to introduce and mandate heavily and change our entire way of life to a significantly lower quality one? I mean, lockdowns are low. It's a low quality way of life. We can't gather. We can't travel. Why are we being so limited around a virus that literally has a survival rate of 99.9%? So we have to start thinking, what is the big picture here? And so I understand why people are associating this with the beast system, and why they're associating it with the Antichrist, and why they're associating it with a lower earth. Because technically transhumanism and synthetic life leads to that. And if we're becoming more and more synthetic, then we're leading to that. We don't know at this point if that's where this is going. I don't know. All I know is that it's very suspicious and that I'm watching. And that when you factor in all of the stuff that's going on the spiritual plane, all of the esoteric information, all of the prophecies that have happened from the great mystics of the past, when we look at that, we have to be very, very skeptical of what's going on. And I genuinely believe that we're not going to understand what's going on until we can take a big look at it from a spiritual perspective. That's when we're going to get our answers. Okay, so here is my last question, and then we are going to wrap up. Edgar Cayce, our consciousness weave together. Is it possible for one of the current mainstream religion truth to manifest, thus determining which would be sent to hell, and if somehow to get out of it? Is it possible for one of the current mainstream religious truth to manifest, thus determining which would be sent to hell? Yeah, well, I think mainstream religions, they try to create a foundation for people to experience spirituality. But spirituality is actually something that's outside any mainstream religion, any dogmatic religion. And the idea of hell or even purgatory is, I think, better understood in the esoteric discussion that we've had today. Also, my lecture on the eighth sphere will get into that. I think that the idea of hell has been greatly exaggerated. It has a lot to do with judgment often, when in reality, this is the reality. We go in the higher worlds where we can handle it. The more cohesive we are as a human being, as a human soul, which means the more in line we are with our Christ consciousness, the higher we can go upon death, or the higher initiate we are in the great school of the solar system, the great school of the cosmos. So wherever we go after death is a direct expression of the condition of our consciousness, the coherency or incoherency of our consciousness. If we become too fragmented by giving into lives of extreme fear and hurting people and going against natural law, because natural law if we follow natural law properly, if we follow Christ consciousness properly, we will accept the virtues as a way of life. And we will see them as a technology almost. We will see the virtues as an emotional, mental technology that we almost adhere to, that lift us out of this plane. That's what the virtues are. If we fall away from the virtues, if we become selfish, if we become dark, our being fragments, and eventually those fragments become reabsorbed into the ether of the cosmos. Eventually, our consciousness will just get sucked back through the black sun corridor of the moon and Saturn and the dark side of the earth, and it will be, that's what hell is. You know, hell is something that we create also in our daily lives, but you know, how we experience death is directly to how we live our life, really. All right, well, it was a complete surprise to me that we got stuck to just doing Rumble. I'm not really sure. I hope a lot of you were able to join me today, even though there was, I guess, a little bit of a switch up. As always, it is my absolute pleasure to be with you this evening. I will be doing more lectures in my Star Wisdom series. You can just go to my website, actually, and there's an event calendar, and you'll be able to see when I schedule a lecture. Also, sign up for my newsletter, and I will always let you know when I'm going to be doing a live Q&A or one of these lectures. I'll send you a notification so that you can attend. I do courses. I have 3 courses you can take if you're interested in developing your intuition. One is for beginners, one is psychic protection, and the other is more advanced. I also have an amazing, amazing community on my website. We have forums, we have discussion groups. We talk about all the kinds of things that you can't talk about on social media. It's great. I do 2 live Q&As a month, long ones, like this long. Like we go for 3 hours, 3.5 hours, and that's every second Sunday. So I'll be doing one next Sunday. If you like this, join me next Sunday on my private platform and become a premium member, and I will see you there and I will take your questions. So without further ado, it has been my pleasure to be with you this evening. As always, all my love your way, and I will see you in our next stream.